The snow has not yet settled when the story begins. It is the kind of snow that drifts sideways, caught by a restless Arctic wind, flakes of light tumbling like ashes over mountains carved by ice. The fjord lies silent, its waters black and still, as though holding its breath. No sound of gulls, no crack of shifting ice, only the hush of a world suspended in white. And then, beneath that hush, there is a stone. It juts out of the frozen earth at an impossible angle, half buried in frost, its surface slick with rime and shadow. A slab of granite, dark as iron, veined like old ice. At first glance it seems no different from the other rocks strewn across the northern wilderness, but step closer and the difference becomes undeniable. Carved into its face is a cross, not the gentle cross of village chapels, not the thin Latin crucifix carried by missionaries. This cross is broader, flared at each end, its arms opening like flames. In the moonlight, it almost resembles the cross worn by the Knights Templar centuries later, painted in crimson on white mantles. Yet this carving is older, its grooves filled with faint traces of pigment red as dried blood, still clinging after hundreds of winters. The villagers call it the Stone of the Whispering King. No one can explain why it stands here, so far from the battlefields of France or the ruins of Rome. No chronicle mentions it, no map records it, and yet for 7 centuries the locals have refused to touch it. They say the wind around it speaks in tongues no one has heard since the age of kings. If you stand there long enough with the snow biting your cheeks and the silence pressing against your chest, you might hear it too. A murmur in the storm, a voice not quite human. They warn travellers not to linger. But imagine for a moment that you are there now. The fjord stretches behind you, a mirror of black water rimmed with pine. The mountains loom above, jagged, glacial, ancient. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. Each step crunches against the crust of snow, echoing far louder than it should in the vastness of the frozen night. You approach the stone. You place your hand against its surface. It is impossibly cold, as if it drinks the warmth from your skin, and for an instant, you feel it. Not a sound exactly, but a pulse, a rhythm, like the beat of a heart, buried not in flesh, but in stone. What king could whisper from such silence? What bloodline could anchor itself here in the far north, so far from its birthplace? The question lingers. Could the Merovingians, the long-haired kings of early medieval Gaul, have left their traces in these frozen lands? The Merovingians. Their name drifts like mist through the half-lit centuries of Europe's early Middle Ages. They were the first royal dynasty of what would become France, rising in the 5th century after the fall of Rome. They ruled with both sword and symbol, claiming divine descent through myth and baptism alike. And yet, as suddenly as they appeared, they seemed to vanish, toppled in silence by the Carolingians in 751 CE. Their last king shorn of his sacred hair and sent away to a monastery. Historians tell us the story ends there, but history, as you know, rarely ends neatly. Whispers persist. Whispers of royal children spirited away, of bloodlines preserved in exile, of alliances forged in shadow, away from the grasp of Rome. Most tales point south, to Languedoc, to Rennes-le-Château, to Grail, legends entwined with Mary Magdalene. But there are other whispers, fainter and colder. Whispers that point north, to icy lakes that never thaw, to chapels where the cross predates Christianity, to sagas of foreign kings with golden hair whose voices carried prophecy. And so we return to the stone. It is not merely a relic, it is a threshold, a marker left by hands unknown, carved in language of symbols rather than words. The cross it bears is neither wholly Christian nor wholly pagan. It exists in a twilight realm, older than cathedrals, yet echoing with the same geometry later worn by Templar knights. To some, this suggests continuity, that what the Templars preserved was not invention, but inheritance, that they carried forward a lineage too sacred or too dangerous to be named aloud. The locals say the stone is cursed. They say if you dream near it, you dream of kings, not the crowned monarchs of Europe's chronicles, but kings who walk in silence, their hair long, their eyes burning with frost, kings who do not die, but sleep. The story waits here, in the snow. And before we can follow it into the darkness of history, we must linger at the threshold. We must learn to listen, not with ears, but with presence. Close your eyes. Imagine the bite of wind on your face, the sharp sting of cold against your lungs. The forest groans under the weight of snow, as though the pines themselves remember. Every sound is muffled, swallowed by frost. And beneath that silence is another silence, older, heavier, the silence of memory. For somewhere beneath your feet lies a secret, not only in ice, but in blood. The Merovingian dynasty begins with a legend. A boy, born of the sea, half human, half myth. His descendants became kings who refused to cut their hair, believing it contained their sacred essence. They ruled for 3 centuries, until the church found them inconvenient. Their line ended with whispers, not war. But the question that haunts every seeker is this: did they truly end, or did they retreat into silence? And what if that silence led them here, to this fjord, this stone, this northern prophecy? When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken. The phrase appears in a disputed manuscript from the 13th century, half Latin, half Old Norse. Scholars dismiss it as poetic invention. Yet for those who have stood before the stone in the snow, the words feel less like metaphor and more like memory. So we begin here, at the edge of certainty, with a cross carved into granite older than it should be, with a whisper in the wind that is neither language nor silence, but something in between, with a question too heavy for chronicles, yet too persistent to vanish. What if the Merovingians did not disappear? What if their bloodline still lingers, not in thrones and palaces, but in frost and pine, in stone and story? The snow drifts heavier now, your footprints blur. The stone watches, silent, cold, unbroken, and the whispering king waits. Long before the cross was carved into stone, long before the winds of the north whispered of a hidden king, there was a boy. His name was Merovech. The chronicles that survive are sparse, fractured, like shards of glass reflecting more legend than fact. Yet from these fragments a story emerges, one that begins not in palaces or in battlefields, but in the sea. They say his mother, a Frankish queen, was walking along the shore when she entered the waves. The day was heavy with salt wind and pale light, the tide restless with secrets. She waded deeper until the water closed around her waist, and there, in the foam, something rose. Some say it was a sea beast, the Minotaur, half bull, half fish, a creature of horn and wave. Others whisper it was no beast at all, but a spirit, a messenger from realms beneath. What happened next is written only in symbols, a union, half mortal, half divine, a child born not entirely of this world. That child was Merovech. Of course historians shake their heads. To them this is myth, a fanciful tale to glorify a dynasty. But myths are not told without reason. Myths are vessels, carrying truths too dangerous or too sacred to write plainly. In the ancient mind, to say a king was born of the sea was not to claim bestial heritage, but to claim otherness, to mark him as touched by forces deeper and older than Rome or Christ. The sea, after all, was a place of origins. It was chaos, womb, grave, and mirror of the heavens. To be born of the sea was to be claimed by mystery, and Merovech carried that mystery in his blood. Imagine him now, not as the shadowy name in Latin annals, but as a boy, his hair long even in youth, pale and flowing, the mark of the kings yet to come, his gaze steady, his presence unsettling. He was both familiar and strange, a child of the Frankish tribes yet set apart. The people whispered when he passed, some crossed themselves, others bowed. All felt that he carried something within him, something not easily named. It is here we glimpse the earlier seed of the Merovingian mystique. Kingship not simply by conquest, but by essence. Authority born not of swords alone, but of blood, of origin, of myth. Merovech grew into a warrior, a leader of the Salian Franks. His dynasty, the Merovingians, took its name from him, and through him the legend endured. The seaborn child whose descendants would wear crowns of Europe. Yet the question remains, why the sea? Why a creature so strange, a Minotaur, half bull and half fish? Symbols speak when words fall silent. The bull is strength, virility, the earthly power of kingship. The fish, in the ancient world, was renewal, mystery, the unseen depths. Joined together, they form a paradox. Power rooted not in soil, but in mystery. A king not of the land alone, but of liminality, the threshold between worlds. This is why the Merovingians mattered. They were not just rulers of tribes, they were embodiments of myth. Their story declared that kingship was sacred, that blood could hold secrets, that a crown could be born not from conquest, but from something far older. And so Merovech's line began. His descendants ruled Gaul through centuries of upheaval, wars against Goths, alliances with Rome, conversions to faiths old and new. But even as they grew into monarchs of flesh and blood, they carried within them the shimmer of myth. This shimmer was not lost on their people. To the Franks, Merovingian kings were rex criniti, the long-haired kings. They did not cut their hair. Their flowing locks were more than vanity. They were sacred. To cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip him of power, to sever the link between his blood and his divinity. In later centuries, rivals did not kill dethroned Merovingian kings. They shaved them. It was the ultimate humiliation, the symbolic death of the sacred essence. Can you feel the weight of this? Hair as sacrament, myth as inheritance, blood as covenant. In a world still reeling from the collapse of Rome, where kingdoms rose and fell like tides, this kind of symbolism mattered more than law. It made the Merovingians untouchable, or so it seemed. The dynasty's greatest figure was Clovis, Merovech's grandson. Ruthless, cunning, a warrior of unmatched ferocity, Clovis united the Franks under one crown. Around 496 CE, he converted to Christianity, sealing a pact with the Roman Church. This baptism, celebrated as a triumph of faith, was also a masterstroke of politics. It gave the Merovingians spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of Rome. But here lies the paradox. If the Merovingians already claimed divine descent, why bow to the authority of Rome? Why let their sacred blood be sanctioned or overshadowed by oil from the Pope's hand? Some say Clovis truly believed. Others suspect he played a deeper game, wielding Christianity not as master but as mask. This is the duality at the heart of the Merovingian legend. Kings who were both pagan and Christian, both sacred and suspect, both embraced and raised. Now return to the image of Merovech rising from the sea. Do you see how it echoes through the centuries? The sea child becomes a king, the king becomes a dynasty. The dynasty becomes a threat, and the threat becomes a whisper. For the church, the Merovingians were dangerous not because they were weak, but because they were sacred in their own right. A bloodline sanctified outside the authority of Rome could not be tolerated. And so, in time, the chronicles turned against them, painting them as idle, drunken, do-nothing kings. Their myth was recast as weakness, their memory slowly suffocated. But myths do not die so easily. They retreat, they wait. Close your eyes again. Picture the waves rolling in the dusk. The tide carries foam across the sand, whispers across the rocks. You see her, the queen, stepping into the sea. You see the shadow rising from the waves, half bull, half fish, horned silhouette against the setting sun. The water churns, the sky darkens, and from that union a child emerges bearing hair of light and eyes of prophecy. This is not history in the modern sense. This is memory in the ancient sense. It is symbol, ritual, myth, and yet it shapes what follows. For without Merovech, the seaborn ancestor, there would be no long-haired kings, no golden bees, no northern prophecy, no whispering stone in the snow. And so we stand at the beginning of the spiral. A child of the sea becomes a dynasty of kings. A dynasty of kings becomes a bloodline in exile. And a bloodline in exile becomes a prophecy carved in ice. The spiral turns inward and outward, carrying us deeper into shadow. And somewhere in the silence of northern forests a stone waits. Its cross flares like the memory of waves. Its whisper carries the voice of a seaborn king. The story continues. The world of the 5th century was a fractured one. Rome, the empire that had once spanned continents, was a shadow of itself. Its legions no longer marched with iron discipline. Its cities crumbled. Its emperors flickered in and out of history like candle flames in the wind. In its place, smaller powers rose, tribes, warlords, and kings whose names echoed faintly in chronicles written by trembling monks. And among them one figure stood taller than the rest, Clovis. He was the grandson of Merovech, the seaborn king, and he carried in his veins both the blood of the Franks and the whisper of myth. Born around 466 CE, Clovis inherited not only a kingdom, but a question: how to survive in a Europe tearing itself apart. The Franks were strong, but they were not alone. To the west, the Visigoths ruled much of Gaul. To the south, remnants of Roman authority still clung to cities, bishops, and fortresses. To the east, Alemanni warriors pressed at borders. and to the north, Saxon pirates prowled the sea. Clovis was young, but he was not blind. He knew that survival required more than the sword. It required vision. Picture him now, a young warlord in iron mail, hair long and uncut in the Merovingian tradition, eyes sharp with calculation. He was ruthless, yes, capable of striking down rivals and allies alike. But there was something more behind his gaze, an awareness that the destiny of his people depended not only on conquest, but on meaning. For in those days, kingship was fragile. A crown was only as secure as the loyalty of one's warriors, the strength of one's alliances, the favour of unseen powers. And Clovis, descendant of the seaborn, carried within him both opportunity and danger. The turning point came in the year 496 in a battle against the Alemanni. The fight was fierce, the outcome uncertain. Clovis's warriors, though brave, faltered under the crushing advance of their enemy. And in that moment, when death pressed close, Clovis did something unexpected. He called upon a god not his own. According to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, Clovis cried out to the Christian God, "Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde proclaims to be the Son of the living God, if you grant me victory over my enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." The tide turned, the Alemanni king fell, the battle was won, and with it a promise was sealed. Clovis's wife, Clotilde, was already Christian, a Burgundian princess of faith and conviction. She had urged him for years to abandon the old gods of his ancestors. Until that day, he had resisted. But after victory on the battlefield, resistance became costly, and so, in the winter of 496, or perhaps 506, for scholars still debate the exact year, Clovis was baptized in Reims. The story says it was Christmas Day. The cathedral glowed with torches and incense, the air heavy with anticipation. Thousands of his warriors followed him into the waters of baptism, their swords glinting in the candlelight as they became, in the eyes of the church, soldiers of Christ. It was more than ceremony, it was transformation. The oil of anointing touched his brow. But some accounts tell a stranger story, that the oil did not come from man at all. They say a white dove descended from the heavens, carrying a vial of sacred chrism. This holy ampulla, as it came to be called, was kept for centuries, guarded by monks used to anoint future kings of France. Myth? Perhaps, but myths, as we have seen, carry weight. For with that anointing, Clovis became more than a warlord. He became a king sanctified by heaven, not just ruler by blood or by sword, but by divine favour. Yet here is the paradox. Did Clovis truly believe? Was his baptism an act of faith, or an act of calculation? For by embracing the Church of Rome, not the Arian Christianity of the Goths and Lombards, but the Nicene orthodoxy of the Pope, Clovis gained more than spiritual legitimacy. He gained an ally. Rome may have been politically weakened, but its bishops and priests held sway over hearts and minds. With their blessing, Clovis's crown was no longer merely tribal, it became continental. The Pope himself hailed Clovis as a new Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome reborn in Frankish flesh. It was a brilliant move. It was also a dangerous compromise, for while Rome's blessing raised Clovis, it also bound him. The Merovingians, long-haired kings of sacred blood, were no longer free to stand apart. Their authority, once rooted in myth and memory, was now tied to the Church. And the Church, as history would show, does not tolerate rivals. The old traditions of the Merovingians, their uncut hair, their pagan rites, their whispers of seaborn ancestry, were tolerated for a time. But bishops watched, wary. They wrote letters, condemning rituals that smacked of druidic practice, warning against funerals conducted beneath stone circles and sacred groves. The tension was clear. Clovis and his descendants may have bowed to Rome, but in their blood they carried something older, something Rome could never fully control. Think of the scene again, the candlelit cathedral, the dove descending, the oil poured upon the brow of a king. To the faithful it was proof of divine favour. To skeptics it was theatre, carefully staged to elevate Clovis above rivals. But to the Merovingians themselves it may have been something different still. Perhaps Clovis believed he was not made holy by Rome, perhaps he believed his blood was holy already. The baptism was not transformation but camouflage, a mask worn to secure power in a fractured world. For a time the mask worked. Clovis expanded his kingdom, conquering rivals, forging alliances, laying the foundation of what would become France. He ruled not as a chieftain, but as a monarch, his authority both temporal and spiritual. His sons and grandsons inherited the crown, their hair flowing, their blood sanctified by myth and oil alike. And yet the seed of conflict was planted. The church grew stronger with each generation, its hand tightening on crowns, its voice shaping chronicles. In time, the long-haired kings would be painted as weak, lazy, do-nothing rulers. But was this truth, or the beginnings of a smear campaign designed to erase a threat? Let us pause here, in the flickering light of Clovis's baptism, and feel the paradox. A king born of a bloodline tied to the sea, to mystery, to silence. A dynasty sanctified by myth, bound now to Rome. A pact struck in oil and water, sealing both survival and doom. The whispers of the north, the prophecy of the ice had not yet been written. But the pattern was already there. The spiral had already begun. The Merovingians rose not by sword alone, but by symbol. And symbols, though buried, endure. Imagine again the cathedral. The scent of incense heavy as fog. The choir chanting, voices echoing against stone. The oil glistening on Clovis's brow. And in the shadows, unseen, the sea remembers. The waves roll against distant shores. The whisper of the seaborn ancestor lingers, reminding us that crowns are fragile but myths are not. Clovis may have gained Rome's blessing, but in doing so he tethered his dynasty to a power that would one day undo it. The spiral turns, the silence waits, and the story moves forward toward betrayal. When the Roman scribes wrote of the Merovingians, they often used a curious phrase, Rex Crinitus, the long-haired king. It was not a metaphor, it was literal. For in the Merovingian world, hair was not fashion, it was power. The sacred hair, from Merovech, the seaborn ancestor, to Clovis and his sons, the kings of this dynasty bore long flowing hair that was never cut. To touch it, to sever it, was to wound more than the body. It was to sever kingship itself. In the pagan imagination of the early Franks, hair carried spirit, vitality, essence. Warriors bound charms into their locks, braiding them with talismans before battle. Priests whispered incantations while pulling strands of hair from the dead. To the Merovingians, the hair of a king was not adornment but sacrament. It was said that their hair shimmered even in the dark like threads of light spun from the sea itself. Enemies feared it, allies revered it, and the people believed that to cut the king's hair was to cut the cord that bound him to the divine. This is why, when Merovingian rulers were deposed, their enemies rarely killed them, instead they shaved them. A shaved king was a dead king even if his heart still beat. Rituals of power. Imagine a coronation in the 6th century, the air heavy with incense, the throne draped in crimson. The king sits in solemn silence. Around him stand the bishops, the nobles, the warriors, their eyes fixed upon him. But what they watch most is not the crown of gold upon his head, it is the hair that spills over his shoulders, long and unbroken. The crown is temporary, a band of metal. The hair is eternal, a symbol of the blood itself. When the king bows to receive anointing, his locks shimmer in torchlight. When he raises his sword, the strands ripple like banners in the wind. His presence is not merely political, it is numinous, charged with unseen energy. The fragile crown, but the sacred hair was both power and peril. As centuries passed, the Merovingian kings began to lose real authority. The so-called mayors of the palace, powerful administrators, ruled in their stead. The long-haired monarchs became ceremonial, kept upon the throne as symbols while others governed in their name, and still their hair remained untouched. It was too dangerous to cut, too sacred to violate. Even as their signatures grew shaky and their voices went unheard, their flowing hair kept them enthroned. Their enemies could not simply drag them down. To do so would be to desecrate something holy, something that even Rome hesitated to profane. But patience runs thin and ambition waits for no crown. The ritual humiliation. In the year 751 CE, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was stripped of his throne, but he was not executed. He was not even exiled. Instead, he was shorn, his long locks cut away, his head shaved clean. The act was public, deliberate, ritualistic. Imagine the silence of the chamber as the shears passed through his hair. Each lock that fell was more than keratin. It was kingship unravelling, power dissolving, divinity undone. Childeric was sent to a monastery, no longer a king, merely a monk, and with him the dynasty ended, or so the chronicles tell us. Hair as symbol, hair as legacy. Why did hair matter so much? In the ancient world, hair was a symbol of connection to the beyond. Samson of the Hebrews lost his strength when Delilah cut his locks. Celtic druids wore their hair long in honour of the gods. Norse warriors tied their braids as offerings to Odin. Everywhere, across cultures, hair was memory, magic, and might. For the Merovingians, whose very origin was tied to the sea and the strange Kinator, hair became proof of their sacredness. It was the visible sign of an invisible inheritance, and this is why the church feared it. For if kingship was carried in the body itself, in hair that could not be cut, then papal anointing was not supreme. The church could crown, bless, and sanctify, but it could not create blood. It could not make hair grow long with sacred power. This rivalry between oil and hair, between sacrament and blood, would shape the fate of Europe. Pagan echoes beneath Christian crowns. Even after baptism, the Merovingian kings kept their old ways. They buried their dead with weapons and horses, a practice frowned upon by bishops. They held feasts in sacred groves. They wore amulets alongside crosses, whispering prayers to saints while still calling upon older powers beneath their breath. In one chronicle, a bishop complains of a funeral rite more fitting for Druids than Christians. In another, a monk laments that Merovingian nobles still consult seers and oracles. These were not rumours. They were the persistence of an older worldview, one the church sought to erase. But the hair remained, always the hair, fragile but enduring. From the outside, the Merovingians seemed fragile, puppet kings, long-haired but powerless, manipulated by their nobles. Yet fragility is not the same as weakness. Even when they held little real authority, their presence mattered. Their crowns, their rituals, their locks of hair carried symbolic weight. And symbols, as history shows, often outlast swords. Perhaps this is why whispers persisted that their line never truly ended, that loyalists spirited away children before the shears could strike, that the sacred hair lived on, hidden, preserved, waiting. For if power lies in blood, then shaving a head cannot extinguish it. The long hair in memory. Even centuries later, the image of the long-haired king lingered. Chroniclers sneered at them as idle and lazy, but the memory of their hair persisted in folk tales, in carved reliefs, in songs. Some spoke of kings who would return when their hair was seen again, flowing like rivers of gold. Others claimed that in secret monasteries, locks of Merovingian hair were preserved in reliquaries, like relics of saints. And in the north, in sagas whispered by Norse poets, there are vague mentions of golden-haired kings from the south, whose voices carried prophecy. Were these echoes of Merovingian fugitives, or merely coincidence? The answer may never be known, but the parallel is striking. For the Norse too revered hair. Their divine kings, the Ynglings and Skjoldungs, traced descent from Odin, wearing their hair as sign of their sacred lineage. They would have understood the power of a king whose hair was untouchable. The hair and the prophecy. If the northern prophecy is true, if blood of the southern kings met the sleep of the ice, then perhaps the hair was more than symbol. Perhaps it was a mark, a sign recognizable even to those far from Gaul. A child arriving in exile, his hair long, his presence unsettling, would not the Norse have seen him as one of their own? The long-haired kings may have been mocked in Rome, dismissed by chroniclers, but in the north their hair could have been seen as proof of destiny. So the story of the Merovingians is not merely of crowns and battles, it is of strands of hair, woven with memory, shimmering with meaning. Hair that was never cut, until the day the dynasty was silenced. And yet, silence is not the same as extinction. The shears may have fallen, the monasteries may have swallowed kings, but the myth of the long hair endured. For symbols, once loosed into the world, cannot be unmade. They drift like whispers in the wind. They take root in stories, in rituals, in songs sung by peasants and nobles alike. They hide in chapels, etched in spirals and bees. They linger, waiting. And perhaps somewhere in the frozen north a king still sleeps, his hair long, unbroken, untouched by shears. The story of dynasties is often told in thunder, battles won, crowns seized, palaces stormed. Yet the fall of the Merovingians did not echo with thunder. It came instead like snow falling in silence, covering tracks until no path could be seen. It was not defeat on a battlefield that ended their reign. It was something subtler, a slow unravelling, a shadowed replacement. The mayors of the palace. By the 7th century, the kings of the Merovingian line still sat on their thrones, long-haired and anointed. Their names appeared in charters, their faces on coins. Yet the true reins of power had slipped from their hands. The daily rule of the kingdom, the judgments, the taxes, the armies, fell instead to the mayors of the palace, men who began as household officials, servants of the crown, but who became its masters. One name rises above the rest, Charles Martel. He was never crowned, never anointed, never called king, yet it was his hand that steered the kingdom. It was he who rallied warriors at the Battle of Tours in 732, halting the advance of Muslim forces from the south. Chroniclers sang of his victory, calling him the Hammer. And though he never wore the crown, the people knew where real power lay. The Merovingian king of the time sat in his palace, hair flowing, crown gleaming, yet he was a figurehead, little more than a relic. The hammer held the kingdom's fate. Puppet kings. The chronicles of these later Merovingians are tinged with disdain. They are called roi fainéants, do-nothing kings. Kings who drank too much, who whispered to priests, who signed whatever documents their mayors placed before them. But one must ask, who wrote these chronicles? It was the monks, the scribes, the pens guided by those who served the rising power of the Carolingians, Charles Martel's line. To them, the Merovingians had to be remembered not as sacred kings undone by conspiracy, but as weak kings replaced by necessity. History, after all, is not only what happens, it is what is written. And so, the long-haired kings, once revered as sacred, as divine, as seaborn, were recast as idle, decadent, unworthy. Their myth of hair and blood was turned into ridicule, their sacred inheritance into laziness. Pepin the Short. Charles Martel never claimed the crown. Perhaps he knew the time was not yet ripe, but his son, Pepin the Short, had no such hesitation. He saw a throne occupied by shadows, a dynasty that still breathed but no longer ruled, and he asked the question aloud, if a man holds the power, should he not also hold the crown? The answer came not from warriors, but from Rome. In 751 CE, Pippin sent envoys to Pope Zachary, asking whether it was right for a powerless dynasty to wear the crown while true authority lay elsewhere. The Pope's reply was swift, calculated, and devastating. He who holds the power should hold the title of king. And with that, centuries of Merovingian rule unravelled. The ritual of erasure. Childeric III, the last of the long-haired kings, was summoned. He was not executed. Execution would have made him a martyr, a sacred victim. Instead, his head was shaved. The scissors cut not only hair but memory, severing the sacred cord that had bound his bloodline to the divine. Then he was sent to a monastery where silence swallowed him. His name vanished from charters, his tomb unmarked. The Carolingians ascended, crowned not only by warriors but by Rome itself. It was one of the most elegant coups in history, bloodless, sanctified, effective. And yet elegant coups leave questions. Why did no rebellion rise? Why do chronicles fall silent about Childeric's fate? Why do no clear records remain of his children, his burial, his end? The silence itself feels deliberate, heavy, chosen. Rome's hand, the Pope's blessing of Pepin, was more than politics. It was theology. By casting aside the Merovingians, Rome asserted that divine authority flowed not through blood, but through papal sanction. It was a declaration that kingship was no longer hereditary alone, but conditional, granted or revoked by the Church. But in making this declaration, Rome also revealed its fear. For what did the Merovingians represent, if not a rival claim to sanctity? A line of kings who declared their blood itself was holy, who wore their hair as crown, who traced descent to myths older than Christendom. To the Church, this was intolerable. It was not laziness that doomed them, but danger. A king who is holy by birth is a king beyond control. The quiet transition, and so the fall was arranged not as war but as silence. Documents erased, charters reassigned, chronicles rewritten. The Merovingians disappeared not with fire but with a quill. The new rulers, Pepin and later Charlemagne, were portrayed as saviours, restorers of order, champions of Rome, and the dynasty they replaced was remembered as irrelevant. But beneath the surface fragments remained. Coins with long-haired kings still buried in earth, tombs with golden bees hidden in shadow, symbols etched into chapels where no chronicler dared to look, and whispers, always whispers, of children spirited away, of heirs hidden in exile, of bloodlines continuing in silence. The smear campaign. It is tempting to believe the chronicles, to accept the image of do-nothing kings who deserved replacement. But the smear campaign is too neat. Consider Dagobert II, a Merovingian king exiled and later restored, only to be assassinated under mysterious circumstances. Was his death mere politics, or a surgical strike to remove a ruler too closely tied to sacred bloodlines? Consider the Council of Frankfurt in 794, decades after the dynasty's fall, which banned symbols of bees and spirals on graves. Why legislate against symbols belonging to a line supposedly extinct? Unless, of course, memory lingered, and memory is dangerous. The Carolingians needed not only to rule, but to justify their rule. To do so, they had to bury the Merovingians twice, once in monasteries and once in memory. The silence. Walk with me for a moment into the silence of that transition. Imagine the halls of a palace emptied of power, its king led away quietly by monks. No swords drawn, no armies clashing, just the sound of scissors, shears against hair, locks falling to the floor. Outside, the people see their king no longer crowned, no longer long-haired, his essence undone, and in that instant they understand. The dynasty is over. But silence can be a mask. What if the shearing was not the end, but the cover? What if loyalists spirited children away before the scissors fell? What if the line did not die, but went underground, waiting for a time to rise again? The frozen north. This is where the trail begins to shift. If the Merovingians had to vanish, where better than in lands beyond Rome's reach? Not to Constantinople, where eyes were sharp, nor to Italy, where papal power grew daily, but north, to Scandinavia, to the fjords, the forests, the frozen silence. There, kings already traced their descent from gods. There, hair was sacred, blood divine, prophecy woven into lineage. A foreign prince with golden hair would not have seemed out of place. He might even have been welcomed. And so the whispers grow. Of children carried across seas, of chapels carved with bees and spirals, of stones etched with crosses flared like those of the Templars. The spiral turns. The Carolingians rose with papal blessing. Charlemagne built an empire, Rome triumphed, and in the official chronicles the Merovingians were nothing more than a memory, mocked as indolent, erased as irrelevant. But the spiral does not end with erasure, for silence is not emptiness, it is preservation, and somewhere in that silence the blood of the seaborn kings may have lingered. Long hair unshorn, crowns unbroken, waiting not in palaces but in exile. The dynasty was replaced, yes. But replaced is not the same as destroyed. History often leaves behind objects that refuse to stay silent. They gleam out of the earth, puzzling archaeologists, whispering of meanings that the chroniclers tried to bury. One such object, or rather 300 such objects, were found in a tomb in the quiet town of Tournai, in what is now Belgium. It was the year 1653 when workers digging in the earth stumbled upon something extraordinary. Beneath layers of soil and stone lay a royal grave, sealed for nearly 1,000 years. It belonged to Childeric III, father of Clovis, one of the earliest Merovingian kings. Inside they found the relics of a monarch, a heavy sword, a cloak fastened with a jewelled brooch, a ring of power. But amid the weapons and gold was something stranger, something shimmering. 300 golden bees, the discovery. They were small, delicate, masterfully crafted. Some had wings spread wide, others folded as if in stillness. Each one was carefully placed around the king's body, as though to swarm him in death. Why bees? Not lions, symbols of courage, not eagles, symbols of empire, not crosses, symbols of the faith he had never fully embraced. Bees. It baffled the scholars of the 17th century, and it baffles scholars still. The symbol of the bee. In the ancient world, bees were never just insects. They were sacred creatures, keepers of order, symbols of immortality and resurrection. In Egypt, bees were born from the tears of Ra. In Greece, priestesses of Artemis were called Melissae, the bees. In the Celtic world, bees were messengers between realms, carrying whispers from the living to the dead. To place golden bees in a king's tomb was no accident. It was a declaration. The Merovingians did not choose lions or eagles because their power did not rest in conquest alone. It rested in continuity, in cycles, in the mystery of life returning after death. Bees vanish in winter, yet they return in spring. They die when they sting, yet their hive endures. They embody a paradox, fragility and immortality entwined. So too with the Merovingians. Bees as resurrection. The golden bees around Childeric's body may have been more than decoration. They may have been guardians, emblems of a promise that the king was not truly dead. That he, like the hive, would rise again when the season turned. Consider the placement. 300 bees, not scattered, not random. They were deliberately arranged as though forming a silent swarm around the body. A swarm to protect him. A swarm to carry his essence into the next world. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose centuries later, he adopted the bee as his imperial symbol. He claimed it as a connection to the ancient Franks, an echo of sacred kingship long forgotten. Whether he knew it or not, he was resurrecting the emblem of the Merovingians. For Napoleon, the bee was a sign of renewal, of continuity beyond the Bourbons he sought to replace. For the Merovingians, it may have been something deeper still, a sign of sacred blood, of a dynasty tied to cycles of life and death older than Rome itself. Bees and silence. But there is another layer to this. Bees are not only symbols of order and immortality, they are also symbols of silence. In many traditions, bees were believed to carry secrets. To speak near a hive was dangerous, for the bees might remember, might carry your words into the other world. In this sense, the golden bees around Childeric's body may have whispered that the Merovingian secret did not end with burial, that the silence surrounding their fall was not emptiness, but preservation. A hive remembers even when the queen is gone. The erasure. Yet, curiously, the golden bees almost vanish from history. After their discovery, many were stolen, melted down, lost to private collections. Only a handful survive today in museums. Was this accident or design? It is tempting to see a pattern. Relics of the Merovingians appearing, then disappearing. Manuscripts burned, symbols banned, tombs disturbed, as though history itself conspired to erase their memory, or as though someone ensured it. The golden bees, fragile and small, should have been dismissed as curiosities. Instead, they haunt. Their presence in the tomb is too deliberate, their symbolism too strong. They refuse to be explained away. Bees in the north, and the bees are not confined to Tournai. In chapels across Scandinavia, places far from Merovingian Gaul, strange carvings appear. In one Swedish church, a bee surrounded by an 8-petaled rose. In Norwegian stave churches, beams etched with spirals and bees. In Icelandic graves, small red stones carved with bee-like patterns. Coincidence or continuity? Perhaps the bees were more than a Merovingian emblem. Perhaps they were a sign carried with exiles into the north, preserved by those who guarded the bloodline in silence. Bees do not stay in one hive, they swarm, they spread. Bees and prophecy. The northern prophecy, fragmented, disputed, speaks of a crown rising again, cold but unbroken. And in some versions of the tale, bees appear as messengers of this return. They carry the silence, one old line reads, and in their swarm the king sleeps. To fringe historians, this is no metaphor. It is code. It is memory of a dynasty preserved not in armies or banners, but in symbols. Bees, roses, spirals, the secret trinity of Merovingian survival. Napoleon's claim, centuries later, Napoleon Bonaparte would stitch bees into his coronation robes, embroider them onto banners, carve them into thrones. He wanted to distance himself from the Bourbons, to root his authority in something older, but perhaps he did not realize how deep he was digging. By choosing the bee, he aligned himself with a legacy that Rome itself had tried to bury. A legacy of kingship not dependent on papal blessing, but on blood, on myth, on sacred inheritance. In Napoleon's bees, the whisper of Childeric's tomb stirred again. The swarm in memory. The golden bees are gone now, most melted or lost. But the idea of them remains, buzzing softly through history like a swarm in winter. Perhaps they are more than ornament. Perhaps they are memory made metal, symbol made flesh. Perhaps they are a message left for those who would look closely. That kings may be cut down, but dynasties return. That crowns may fall, but blood remembers. That silence is not emptiness, but a hive waiting to awaken. The whisper of the hive. Close your eyes, imagine the tomb. The air is cold, damp, smelling of earth and stone. Torches flicker, a coffin is opened, and there, amid weapons and jewels, the bees gleam. They do not hum, yet you feel the hum inside your chest, low and steady. A hive that does not die. A memory that does not fade. They whisper not in words, but in presence. They remind you that history is not only written, it is also swarmed, carried, hidden, preserved. The Merovingians may have been silenced, but their bees still fly, in stone, in wood, in whispers, in dreams. The golden bees in the tomb of Childeric are not only relics, they are signals, they are keys, they are fragments of a language older than crowns and crosses, a language of silence, resurrection, and memory. And in their fragile shimmer lies a truth, that the Merovingians, like the hive, may have vanished from sight but never from being. The spiral turns, the swarm waits, and the silence hums. The chronicles whisper of many Merovingian kings, Clovis the Conqueror, Childeric the Buried with Bees, but one name rises again and again in the shadows of speculation. A king both remembered and erased, whose death was written in ink but remembered in silence. His name was Dagobert II, a king in exile. Dagobert was born into the twilight of the dynasty. The Merovingian crown, though still sacred, had grown brittle. Real power had passed to the mayors of the palace, those ambitious stewards who ruled behind the throne. Yet Dagobert's blood was no less potent. He was Merovingian, long-haired, sacred. That made him dangerous. As a child, Dagobert was exiled, spirited away to Ireland, far from the Frankish heartlands. Officially, it was for his safety. In truth, it was to keep him from the throne. In monasteries and remote courts, he grew not as a prince of pomp, but as an exile marked by destiny. Imagine him there, a boy with hair uncut, growing long as he grew tall, his presence unsettling in cloisters of stone. The monks whispered that he carried something in his gaze, something the church could not quite tame. His bloodline shimmered even in exile. Returned to the throne. Years later, Dagobert returned. The tides of politics shifted, alliances cracked, and his restoration became expedient. He was placed once more upon the throne of Austrasia, one of the fragmented kingdoms of the Franks. For a time, it seemed the Merovingian legacy might strengthen again, but power built on fear is fragile. Dagobert was not merely a king. He was a reminder of a bloodline sanctified by myth, of kingship rooted in hair, blood, and seaborn legend rather than papal blessing. And reminders are dangerous to those who rule by decree. The murder in the forest. In the year 679, Dagobert rode into the forest on a hunting expedition. His court followed, the hounds baying, the horns echoing against the trees. The forest was alive with sound. The crack of branches, the rush of hooves, the breath of men and animals mingling in cold air. But then came silence. Somewhere in the shadows an assassin waited. A blade glinted, a hand steadied, and in a moment the king was struck. The chronicles say he was stabbed in the eye. It is a detail too precise, too haunting to be forgotten. The eye, the window of vision, the organ of prophecy. To strike there was not only murder, it was ritual, symbolic, silencing not just the man but the sight. Dagobert fell in the forest, his blood seeping into roots and moss. His death was reported with brevity, noted in passing by scribes. No grand funerals, no elaborate accounts, only silence. Was it the church who ordered the death? The chronicles do not say, they never do. But whispers have long accused the church. Dagobert, after all, was inconvenient. He was a sacred king at a time when Rome sought to establish its own monopoly on sanctity. A king who could trace his blood to Merovech, who carried hair uncut as crown, who ruled by inheritance older than papal decree, such a king could not be allowed to endure. And so, in the hush of a forest, an assassin ended his reign. The erasure, but death alone was not enough. Memory had to be erased as well. Unlike Clovis, Dagobert was never canonized, never celebrated. His name was buried beneath layers of obscurity. In official chronicles, he became a footnote, a minor ruler whose death barely mattered. And yet in the shadows his name survived. For some, Dagobert became the sleeping king of Gaul, the one who did not truly die but waits, hidden, destined to return. For others, he became a martyr of secrecy, his blood spilled not for failure, but for truth. In later centuries his name re-emerged in strange places, in Grail legends, in whispers of the Priory of Sion, in genealogies that claimed the sacred bloodline never ended but passed through him into silence. The eye of prophecy. The wound in the eye became a symbol in itself. Medieval lore often connected the eye with vision, both physical and spiritual. To blind or pierce the eye was to extinguish prophecy, to sever connection with divine sight. Was Dagobert struck in the eye by chance or by ritual? Some fringe scholars argue that his assassination was staged as a rite, silencing the prophetic bloodline of the Merovingians. Others note that in Celtic and Norse myth alike, sacrifice of the eye was tied to wisdom. Odin gave his eye for knowledge. To wound Dagobert's eye may have been to claim his sight, to steal the legacy of his blood. Whispers in the Grail. Centuries later, legends of the Holy Grail would circle back to Dagobert's name. In certain versions, the Grail was not a chalice but a bloodline. The royal line descended from Christ and Mary Magdalene, carried into Gaul, woven into Merovingian veins. If this were true, and if Dagobert carried that blood, then his assassination takes on darker meaning. It was not merely political, it was theological. To kill Dagobert was to sever a dangerous claim, that sacred kingship might exist outside Rome's blessing, rooted not in papal authority but in blood older than the Church, the shadow legacy. Dagobert's death should have closed the chapter, but instead it opened whispers. Some tales claim his children were hidden, spirited away before the assassins struck. Some speak of loyalists who carried his descendants north into exile. Others believe his blood was preserved through marriage, absorbed quietly into noble houses that still trace cryptic genealogies. In Scandinavia, sagas speak of foreign kings with golden hair who came from the south, their voices heavy with prophecy. Coincidence or continuity? The forest that swallowed Dagobert's blood became, in legend, less a grave and more a threshold. A place where kings vanish but do not die, where blood spills but does not end. The forester's tomb. Walk there in your imagination. The forest is dense, the air cold, the ground soft with moss. You hear the dogs baying, the horn sounding, and then the sudden silence. You see the king fall, his eye dark with blood, his hair spread upon the leaves like a golden shroud. And you feel it. This is not just death, it is initiation. A king silenced, but a story awakened. The trees remember, the earth remembers, the silence itself remembers. The dangerous question. Why does Dagobert matter so much? Because his story embodies the danger of the Merovingian myth. His exile, his return, his assassination, all echo the tension between sacred blood and political power. He's the proof that the dynasty did not fall naturally, but was cut down, pruned like a branch that threatened to grow too wild. And yet, in cutting, one also spreads. A branch removed may take root elsewhere. Perhaps Dagobert's death was not the end of the bloodline, but the beginning of its exile. Perhaps his blood flowed not only into the soil of the forest, but into veins that would carry it northward, into lands of ice and silence. The king who sleeps. In French folklore, in Celtic legend, in Norse sagas, there is a recurring figure, the sleeping king, a ruler who does not die, but waits. Arthur beneath the hill, Charlemagne in his cave, Dagobert beneath the forest. The pattern is unmistakable. Sacred kings are never allowed a simple end. Their deaths are doorways, their silences vaults. They linger, waiting for a time when the world will call them back. Dagobert, stabbed in the eye, fallen in the forest, may be one such king, not dead but sleeping, not lost but hidden, not erased but waiting. Silence after the blade. The chronicles fall silent after his death. Too silent. No rebellion, no aftermath, no detailed account of burial. A silence thick enough to suggest suppression. And yet silence is not nothing, silence is a kind of memory. The Church may have wished to erase Dagobert. The Carolingians may have needed his absence. But memory persists in whispers, in symbols, in the stubborn endurance of names. Dagobert's name surfaces centuries later where it should not. In genealogies of obscure nobles, in Norse sagas, in Templar archives. Each fragment is a bee, a spiral, a whisper. Together they form a swarm of memory that refuses to die. Dagobert Thecke fell in the forest, but perhaps he did not fall alone. Perhaps his blood, his sight, his legacy walked out of that forest in silence, hidden, preserved, awaiting a time when silence itself would speak. The spiral turns, the silence deepens, and the blood remembers. History leaves behind not only bones and crowns, but words, and sometimes those words come not in grand chronicles, but in the margins, scrawled in half-light, whispered in symbols, preserved where no one was meant to look. So it is with the Northern Prophecy, the manuscript in Iceland. In 1928, in a monastery attic in northern Iceland, a fragile bundle of parchment was discovered. Misfiled among hymns and sagas, brittle with age, it smelled of salt and smoke. The archivist who unfolded it expected another fragment of Norse verse. What he found instead was stranger. The text was written in a hybrid tongue, Latin but laced with old Norse words, as though the scribe himself lived between worlds, and within it lay a passage that baffled scholars. When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken. No author's name, no date, only this fragment pulsing with meaning impossible to ignore. A poetic line or a coded message? At first historians dismissed it. A poetic flourish, a metaphor for winter, perhaps even the scribbling of a monk entranced by allegory. But others looked closer. The phrase, Blood of the southern kings was unusual. In Iceland, south referred not to Rome, but to Gaul, Frankish lands where the Merovingians once ruled. And who else in medieval memory were called kings of blood if not the long-haired monarchs whose lineage claimed a sacred origin? The sleep of the ice was clearer still, a metaphor for exile in the north, for burial not in soil but in frost, and the final phrase, cold but unbroken, rang with defiance. It suggested survival, not extinction. A crown hidden, not lost. A prophecy or a report? What if this was not prophecy at all? What if it was code? A veiled message passed between loyalists, recorded in the safe remoteness of Iceland. A signal that the Merovingian bloodline, declared extinct in Frankish chronicles, had not perished but had been preserved. The words may not foretell the future, they may record the present. A bloodline in exile waiting in silence. Echoes in stone. The Icelandic fragment was not unique. On the Norwegian coast, in a cave network known as Blåfjell, researchers discovered a faded inscription carved into stone. The script resembled Carolingian minuscule yet older. It read, Regnum non perit, sed dormit. The kingdom does not perish, it sleeps. The sentiment mirrors the Icelandic prophecy almost exactly. Two texts, two regions, both whispering the same refrain. A crown hidden in ice, not destroyed, but dormant. Coincidence or conspiracy? The timing. Carbon dating places the ink of the Icelandic manuscript in the late 13th or early 14th century. Suspiciously, or perhaps significantly, this was the very era when two great disappearances occurred. First, the Merovingians vanished from Europe's official history, their line erased with the deposition of Childeric III. Second, the Knights Templar were suppressed in 1307, their leaders arrested, their fleets vanished. To fringe researchers, this overlap is no accident. The prophecy, they argue, emerged in the very shadows of these vanishings, as if to record what the chronicles would not. The whisper of the Templars. The Templars were more than warriors. They were guardians of relics, keepers of knowledge, builders of chapels heavy with symbol. When King Philip IV of France struck against them in 1307, many were captured, tortured, executed. But not all. Entire fleets disappeared from the port of La Rochelle, sailing into the night, never seen again. Most assume they fled to Portugal or Scotland, but another theory whispers that they sailed north, to lands beyond Rome's reach, to Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, lands of silence. And if they carried relics, manuscripts, or even people, if they carried heirs of sacred blood, then the northern prophecy may not be allegory at all. It may be a record of their arrival. Chapels of silence. Evidence lingers in stone. In Sweden, in the ruins of Skaga Chapel, a traveller in 1933 recorded an engraving on the wall, a cross with flared arms enclosed in a circle, nearly identical to the Merovingian croix pattée later adopted by Templars. Beneath it, faint words, per glacium transit regnum vivit. Through ice the kingdom lives. In Norway, stave churches bear columns carved with spirals, roses and bees, motifs absent from official Norse iconography, yet familiar to those who study Merovingian symbology. Always hidden, always subtle, as though carved for those who already knew. Are these coincidences of medieval art, or deliberate markers of a secret lineage preserved in silence? Oral fragments. Legends tell their own tale. In northern Iceland, villagers spoke of a barn Thögna konungsins, the child of the silent king, a boy with a red circle over his heart who never spoke but was said to dream the future. His family vanished without trace, yet the story endured. In Sweden, peasants whispered of a foreign king who came by sea, golden-haired, who sought shelter from those with white crowns, perhaps a veiled reference to papal authority. He did not speak, they said, but his eyes burned like frost. Folklore, perhaps, but folklore is memory that refuses to die, a living prophecy. Some claim the prophecy has a second part, never written but carried orally. The crown shall rise not through war but through memory, not through conquest but through recognition. It shall return with those who hear the frost speak. A poetic line or a ritual instruction passed from guardian to guardian. If true, then the northern prophecy is not about armies or battles. It is about survival through silence, resurrection through remembrance. Skepticism. Mainstream scholars dismiss it all. To them, the Icelandic fragment is monastic allegory. The Norwegian inscription a coincidence. The chapel engravings mere flourish. They argue that every medieval dynasty used sacred symbols, that parallels mean nothing, but their dismissal itself is telling. Why do these fragments recur in places they should not? Why do they align in language, symbol, and timing? Why, if meaningless, do they persist? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A crown of silence? Perhaps the prophecy is true. Perhaps when the Merovingians fell, their blood was carried north by those who still believed. Perhaps the Templars, protectors of relics and secrets, became guardians of a lineage rather than a kingdom. If so, then the prophecy is not foretelling, it is reporting. It is the record of a survival no chronicle dared admit, a crown hidden not in palaces but in silence, a kingdom preserved not in armies but in memory, cold but unbroken. The whisper in the ice. Close your eyes now. Imagine the fjords of Norway, the valleys of Iceland, the forests of Sweden. The snow falls softly, muffling all sound. Beneath the silence you feel something waiting. A pulse, a whisper, like the hum of bees in winter. You remember the words, "The kingdom does not perish, it sleeps." Perhaps the prophecy is not waiting to be fulfilled. Perhaps it is already true. Perhaps the bloodline sleeps even now, preserved in frost, waiting not to conquer, but to be remembered. The northern prophecy is more than a line of text. It is a thread that binds together stone, symbol, and silence. It is a whisper across centuries that the Merovingians did not die, but retreated, that their crown is not broken, only hidden. And in that whisper, history bends. The story of the Merovingians drifts like mist through the forests of Gaul and the fjords of Scandinavia. But there is another thread woven tightly into the tapestry, a thread of warriors in white mantles, marked with a red cross, who rose from nothing to become the most powerful order of their age, the Knights Templar, the rise of the poor knights. Founded in 1119 in the wake of the First Crusade, they began humbly. 9 knights sworn to protect pilgrims travelling the dangerous road to Jerusalem. They called themselves Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templica Salomonisi, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But within decades, they were no longer poor. They became an army, a bank, a network of fortresses and farms stretching across Europe and the Holy Land. They were warrior monks, feared in battle, trusted with treasure, answerable only to the Pope. And yet, beneath their vows of poverty and piety, whispers circulated. What had they found beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem where they dug for years? What relics? What scrolls? What secrets? Some say they discovered genealogies, records tracing the bloodline of Christ himself, carried through Mary Magdalene through Gaul into the veins of the Merovingian kings. If true, then the Templars were not only guardians of pilgrims, they were guardians of blood. The fall of the order? By the 14th century, their power had grown too great. King Philip IV of France, iron-willed, drowning in debt, saw them as a threat. On the morning of October 13th, 1307, his soldiers struck. Across France, Templars were arrested at dawn, accused of heresy, idolatry, corruption. Many were tortured, forced to confess to crimes they had not committed. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris. The order was shattered, but not destroyed, for while Philip struck in France, he could not reach everywhere at once. Some Templars fled to Portugal, where they became the Order of Christ. Others vanished into Scotland, and then there are the whispers of a fleet. The vanished fleet of La Rochelle. In the port of La Rochelle, a Templar stronghold on the French coast, chroniclers recorded an unsettling detail. On the eve of the arrest, ships slipped out of harbour. A fleet vanished into the night, carrying men, treasure, and perhaps something more. Where did they go? Most say west, toward Portugal, perhaps even across the Atlantic, but others whisper north, to lands beyond Rome's reach, to Norway, to Iceland, to the silent fjords where memory is kept in stone and ice. Guardians of a secret. If the Templars carried only gold, history would have recorded it. Kings and popes thirsted for treasure, but the silence surrounding the fleet suggests something else, something more dangerous than wealth. What if they carried people? What if they carried heirs of a bloodline Rome wished to erase? The theory is daring, but it fits the pattern. The Merovingians had been dethroned centuries earlier, their sacred hair shorn, their bloodline declared extinct. But whispers of survival persisted, children spirited away, lineages preserved. If such heirs existed, who better to guard them than the Templars, men bound by oath, wealthy, powerful and already suspected of heresy. The Templars may have been more than warriors. They may have been custodians of blood. Symbols in the north, evidence lingers in fragments. In a stave church in Røldal, Norway, a carved beam shows what appears at first to be a simple cross. But look closer. Its arms flare. Its centre is marked with a small circle, near identical to the Merovingian cross patay, later used by the Templars. In Gotland, Sweden, a chapel ruin bears an inscription in Latin, Per sanguinem regnum vivit, through blood the kingdom lives. And in Iceland, genealogies of obscure families record strange origins, southern knights arriving by ship, marrying into local lineages, keeping silent. Coincidence or continuity? The Sleeping Crown. One Icelandic manuscript written in the 15th century speaks cryptically of men in white mantles who brought the sleeping crown to the edge of the world, where the stars rise with fire. The phrase sleeping crown echoes the northern prophecy. Was this legend mere poetry, or a memory of the vanished fleet, carrying with them not only relics but a royal claim? Perhaps the Templars did not flee to save themselves. Perhaps they fled to save someone else. Silence as strategy. The Church declared the Templars heretics, burned their leaders, seized their lands. Yet silence fell around the north. No great purges in Norway, no mass arrests in Iceland. Why? Perhaps because the Templars were never officially recorded there. Their presence, if it existed, was hidden. Small chapels, remote farms, outposts that escaped the ledgers of bishops. Invisible to Rome, they survived in silence, and silence, as we have seen, is preservation. The connection to blood. The most provocative theory is this, that the Templars were not destroyed because of greed or heresy, but because they had come too close to something ancient. That beneath Jerusalem, they found records linking Christ's bloodline to the Merovingians. That they swore to protect this line, even after its throne was stripped away. If true, then their fall was not about treasure at all. It was about erasure of a truth too dangerous for Rome. And if they fled north, carrying with them relics, scrolls, or heirs, then the northern prophecy is no metaphor. It is the map of their survival. Walk the imagined trail. Picture it now. The fleet sailing from La Rochelle, sails flaring white against the night. The sea black, the wind sharp, the silence heavy. On board, not only knights and treasure, but a child with golden hair, wrapped in a cloak guarded by swords and vows. They sail north, into waters of storm and frost, into fjords where pine forests groan with age, where the ice remembers. They arrive in silence, they vanish in silence, but they do not die. The trail continues in symbols etched into chapels, in bees carved into beams, in spirals traced upon stone, a language of memory preserved by those who swore to guard it. The red cross and the golden bee, again and again these motifs return, the Templar cross, the Merovingian bee, the spiral of eternity, sometimes carved alone, sometimes entwined, always hidden where only the initiated might notice. Could it be that these were not decorations but instructions? That the Templars left a trail for future guardians, a silent map pointing to where the bloodline was kept? If so, then the Templars did not fall. They transformed, from warriors of Christ to keepers of silence, from knights of the temple to guardians of a lineage. The unfinished story. The chronicles tell us the Templars were destroyed in 1307, but chronicles are written by victors. The symbols, the legends, the whispers suggest something else, that they survived in places Rome could not touch, that they carried with them a secret too old to be forgotten. And if that secret was the blood of the Merovingians, then the Templar connection is not conjecture, it is continuity. The story of the Merovingians cannot be told without the Templars, for in their fall another silence opened, and in that silence perhaps the bloodline endured. The spiral turns, the fleet vanishes, the silence deepens, and somewhere in the north the crown sleeps, cold but unbroken. History often hides not in palaces or chronicles, but in beams of wood, in stones set into quiet chapels where no armies march. And in the far north, in Norway, Sweden, Iceland, there are churches that whisper a language older than Rome. They do not shout, they do not declare, they murmur, carved into oak, painted on walls, etched into thresholds. Symbols that seem out of place yet linger, symbols that might carry the memory of kings in exile. The stave churches. Walk with me into Norway, into the shadow of a stave church. These wooden cathedrals rise like dark ships upon the land, their timbers blackened with tar, their roofs steep and layered, crowned with dragon heads to ward off evil. Step inside, the air is heavy with resin and age, smelling of pine and smoke. Candles flicker, shadows cling to beams carved with spirals, roses, and knots that twist endlessly into themselves. To the casual eye, these are decorations. To the initiated, they may be more. For here, amid Norse dragons and Christian crosses, one sometimes finds a bee. Small, hidden, carved into the corner of a beam. A golden creature in dark wood. Why a bee in a church so far north? Bees in the timber. At Hopperstad, Urness and Borgund, scholars have noted strange insect-like carvings stylized and repeated. Official explanations call them floral motifs, abstractions of vines. But to others, they look unmistakably like bees, wings folded, bodies segmented. Bees, as we know, were the emblem of Childeric's tomb. Bees, symbols of resurrection, silence, and continuity. Bees, carried perhaps by exiles, encoded into churches where few would notice. If true, then the bees of the north are not decoration. They are signal, a whisper of a dynasty preserved. Roses and spirals. The bees do not stand alone. They are often paired with roses, 6-petaled or 8, carved with mathematical precision. The rose was no stranger to Christian art, yet its form here seems older, geometric, almost Merovingian. In Gaul, Merovingian chapels bore the rose as symbol of secrecy, of blood preserved, of silence sworn, and around both bees and roses spirals unfurl, spirals that loop endlessly without beginning or end, spirals that recall the golden ratio, the eternal coil of memory. Together, bee, rose, spiral, they form a trinity of symbols, a language not of words but of shape, a code that those who carried the bloodline might recognize. Oral whispers. In Sweden, peasants once told tales of de vitklädda bröderna, the white-clad brothers, who came by sea and built chapels unlike any seen before. They wore no crowns, yet their presence was kingly. They left behind carvings, cryptic and deliberate. In Iceland, old songs mention biflugur konungsins, the king's bees, said to guard a crown hidden beneath ice. These were sung not in cathedrals but by farmers in fields, passed down as lullabies that seemed harmless, yet carried an echo. Coincidence or continuity? Architecture of silence. The stave churches themselves carry secrets. Many are aligned not only to east and west as Christian law required, but to stars. At Borgund, the doorway aligns with the rising of Sirius, the star long associated with rebirth, with the flooding of the Nile, with cycles of immortality. Why would rural Norwegians build such alignments? Unless their architects carried knowledge not entirely Norse, not entirely Christian. Knowledge perhaps brought by exiles, knights, monks, guardians, who sought to preserve memory in silence. A church is more than stone, it is symbol-made architecture. The hidden cross. In Hedard, Sweden's only surviving stave church, a peculiar cross is carved into the altar rail. Its arms flare outward, broader than a Latin cross, more akin to the Merovingian croix patée. Scholars call it Templar influence brought by wandering knights. But what if it was not influence, but inheritance? The Merovingians vanished from France in silence. The Templars vanished from La Rochelle in silence, and in the north, in hidden chapels, a flared cross appears. Silent, persistent, unbroken. The guardian families. Local genealogies tell stranger tales still. In Västergötland, Sweden, a family named Bjelke traced its origins to knights from the south who arrived in the 14th century. Their coat of arms bore a spiral. In Iceland, the Odavajar family preserved a story of a foreign prince sheltered by their ancestors. They claimed no crown, but their farm carried a peculiar seal, a bee within a circle. In Norway, the Galte family kept records of marriage to brothers in white, and their crest bore not lions or axes but roses. Symbols again, always the same, always hidden in plain sight. Rome's silence. What did Rome know of these chapels, these families, these symbols? Perhaps nothing. Scandinavia, after all, lay at the edge of Christendom. Remote, wild, only loosely tethered to papal authority. Yet papal bulls from the 12th and 13th centuries warned against foreign cults in the north, against signs of bees, roses, and coils in churches. Why warn unless such signs existed? Why forbid unless such memory persisted? It seems Rome's fear followed even into frozen lands, the fear that the sacred bloodline had not died, but slept. The language of carvings. Stand once more in a stave church. The light is dim, filtered through narrow slits of windows. Smoke curls upward, mixing with the scent of tarred wood. A hymn hums low. Look to the beams, you see spirals, roses, bees, you see a cross not quite Latin. To most they are patterns, nothing more. To the few they are language, a language that says, we remember. Symbols endure when words are forbidden. Bees endure when kings are shorn. Chapels endure when chronicles erase. The silent alliance. The evidence suggests a possibility both simple and profound, that Merovingian exiles, perhaps carried by Templars, found refuge in the north. That they married into local families, built chapels infused with their symbols, preserved their legacy not in armies, but in carvings, and that for centuries these signs lingered, quiet, unnoticed, but unbroken, a silent alliance between blood and stone, the prophecy in timber. The northern prophecy spoke of a crown preserved in ice, cold but unbroken. Perhaps these churches are its proof, not prophecy, but record, not foretelling, but testimony. The bees in the beams, the roses on the walls, the spirals on the thresholds all whisper the same truth. The kingdom does not perish, it sleeps. Step outside. As you leave the stave church, the cold air strikes your face. The mountains loom, the forest whispers, and behind you the church remains, dark and solemn, its beams heavy with centuries. The symbols are still there. They have outlasted kings and popes, empires and wars. They will outlast us too, for silence is a hive, memory is a spiral, blood is a rose, and in the frozen north the signs remain. Legends whisper, carvings hint. But sometimes history speaks with bones and stones. In the soil of the north, beneath fjords, fields and forests, there are fragments that do not belong, artifacts that seem out of place, graves that refuse to conform, inscriptions that whisper of a past unrecorded. These are not grand monuments, they are oddities, small, dissonant, easy to dismiss, and yet taken together they form a pattern. A grave in Birka. Birka, the great trading hub of Viking Sweden, holds countless graves. Most are Norse, filled with swords, shields, beads, and the bones of warriors and merchants. But in the 19th century, archaeologists opened a mound that puzzled them. The skeleton within was buried in a style unlike the others. The grave goods were minimal, no ship, no runes, no Thor's hammer. Instead, there was a brooch in the shape of a bee. Its wings spread, its body elongated, crafted in gold. To Norse eyes it meant nothing. To Merovingian memory it meant everything. The bee of Childeric, the bee of immortality, the bee of resurrection. What was it doing in Birka centuries after the dynasty had fallen? Frankish swords in the north. Other finds deepen the puzzle. In Norway, swords of unmistakably Frankish make have been unearthed. Blades forged not in Viking smithies, but in the workshops of Gaul. Some could be explained by trade, but others, too ornate for merchants, suggest noble lineage. One sword discovered in Rogaland bore a hilt engraved with a spiral, identical to those found in Merovingian graves in France. The spiral was not Norse, it was foreign, deliberate, a signature of exile. Was this a gift, a trophy, or the possession of someone who carried Frankish blood into the north? Stones with Latin. In Finland, on the windswept Åland Islands, stands a stone carved with words no Norse runemaster would use, in hoc signo vinces. By this sign you will conquer. The phrase, attributed to Constantine's vision of the cross before battle, is pure Latin, pure Roman Christianity. Yet the stone is dated to the 11th century, long before Latin inscriptions were common in Finland. Who carved it? Some suggest missionaries, others argue for Templar travellers, but perhaps it was carved by descendants of those who remembered a bloodline, sanctified not by Rome, but connected to it in rivalry. A bloodline whose exile required secrecy, but not forgetfulness. Bees in the chapels. In Sweden's Varnum Abbey, archaeologists uncovered fragments of stained glass. Among them, a panel depicting a bee. Not a lion, not an eagle, but a bee, shimmering once with gold paint. Abbeys did not normally depict insects, and yet here it was, preserved in fragments. The bee again, always the bee. Was this coincidence or continuity? The mixed graves. One of the strangest patterns is the graves themselves. In several Scandinavian sites, archaeologists have found burials that mix Frankish and Norse practices. Skeletons interred with swords forged in Gaul, but placed alongside Thor's hammers. Women buried with Merovingian-style brooches, but within longhouses aligned to Norse ritual. They do not fit clean categories, they are hybrids, they are lives lived between worlds. Such graves suggest more than trade, they suggest migration, intermarriage, bloodlines carried across the sea. The spiral in stone. In Gotland, at a site known as Stavgard, an unusual stone carving was found. A spiral, etched deep, encircled by bees. The spiral turns inward, endless, unbroken. Scholars argue it may be decorative, but the spiral was sacred to the Merovingians, appearing in their chapels carved into tombs. In Norse art, spirals are rare, and when they appear, they are usually serpent coils. But this spiral was different. Mathematical, geometric, deliberate. It seemed less like decoration, more like code. The disappearance of evidence. Curiously, many of these finds vanish. The bee brooch from Birka, lost in the early 20th century. The spiral sword hilt, misfiled in archives. The stained glass bee, shattered further in storage. Again and again, artifacts linked to Merovingian symbols are lost. Accident or design? History has a habit of erasing what it finds inconvenient. And silence, as always, is preservation. The Templar trail. Some researchers link these oddities not only to Merovingians, but to Templars. After the fleet vanished from La Rochelle, the north became a plausible refuge. If Templars carried with them relics of Merovingian memory, they may have encoded them into chapels, graves, and symbols. The bee brooch, the Latin stone, the spiral carving, all could be the faint trail of guardians in exile, a secret pilgrimage etched into the land itself. The northern prophecy again, and the Icelandic prophecy returns. When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again. Perhaps these artifacts are not stray curiosities. Perhaps they are the bones of that prophecy, the physical proof that blood and ice did meet, that the dynasty, stripped of crowns in Gaul, lived on in frost and fjord. The graves are not errors, they are testimonies. Walk among the oddities. Close your eyes. Imagine walking through a Scandinavian field in summer, the grass whispering against your legs, the sky vast above. Beneath your feet, unseen, lie bones. Bones of a warrior with a Frankish sword, bones of a woman with a bee brooch, bones of a child buried with a spiral stone. They do not shout, they do not demand, they wait. And if you listen, the earth itself whispers, the blood did not end, it slept. The hive beneath the soil. Archaeological oddities are like bees in winter. Still, silent, seemingly dead. But beneath the frost, they live. The bee brooch, the spiral hilt, the Latin stone, they are fragments of a hive of memory preserved beneath soil and snow, waiting for spring. And perhaps one day the swarm will rise again. The graves, the artifacts, the inscriptions, these are not accidents. They are continuity. They are silence given form. They are proof, however faint, that the Merovingian story did not end with scissors and monasteries. The spiral turns, the silence deepens, and the earth remembers. Power is never secure. Thrones tremble not only from swords but from symbols. And for Rome, nothing was more dangerous than a rival claim to sanctity. The Merovingians were not simply kings. They were living sacraments. Their hair long, their blood seaborn, their bees immortal. They embodied a kingship that did not need papal blessing. And that, more than armies, more than crowns, was what Rome feared. The papal monopoly. From the earliest centuries, the Church sought to centralize spiritual authority. The Pope crowned emperors, anointed kings, declared who ruled by God's will. This monopoly gave Rome its strength. But the Merovingians had never truly needed papal oil. Their sanctity was older, woven into their lineage. They were kings because they were born kings, their blood infused with myth. To shave their hair was to unmake them, not by decree, but by desecration. This was the danger, that kingship might exist outside Rome's hands. Chronicles rewritten, and so, when the Carolingians replaced the Merovingians, the scribes sharpened their quills. Gregory of Tours, writing earlier, praised the vigour of Clovis. But later chroniclers painted Merovingians as idle, drunken, rouis fainéants, do-nothing kings. They became caricatures, men lying in bed while others ruled, shadows of rulers, weak and pathetic. But is this history or propaganda? Consider the Carolingians needed legitimacy. Rome needed control. Both had reason to diminish the long-haired kings, to make their sacred blood appear worthless, to bury myth beneath ridicule. And so the chronicles were shaped not by truth but by fear. The Council of Frankfurt, in 794, decades after the last Merovingian king had been shorn and sent to a monastery, the Council of Frankfurt met under Charlemagne. Among its decrees was a peculiar ban. No graves were to bear certain symbols, spirals, bees, coils, roses. They were dismissed as pagan, superstitious, unworthy of Christian burial. Why legislate against symbols of a dynasty supposedly extinct? Because memory lingered. Because peasants still carved bees into stones, still placed spirals upon graves. Because silence was not enough, Rome wanted erasure. The council's decree was not about superstition. It was about suppression, the theft of relics. Relics were another battleground. The Merovingians had buried their dead with bees, roses, golden spirals. They had built chapels infused with sacred geometry. Many of these sites were later plundered, their relics taken not by Vandals but by church authorities. The bees of Childeric's tomb vanished, melted, stolen. The spiral carvings of Frankish chapels were defaced. The long-haired effigies of kings were broken, their heads severed. It was not destruction, it was ritual erasure. To control relics was to control memory. To erase symbols was to silence myth. The fear of blood. But why fear so deeply? Because the Merovingians embodied an idea Rome could not abide, that sanctity could be inherited, that blood itself might be divine. Christianity insisted holiness came through baptism, sacraments, grace. Anyone, in theory, could be sanctified through the church. But the Merovingians whispered a different truth, that some were born holy, their bloodline itself, a relic. If true, the church's monopoly on sanctity was broken, and so the blood had to be silenced. The silencer's strategy. Rome was careful. It did not massacre the Merovingians in open war. It shaved them, exiled them, erased them from memory. A bloodless coup, sanctified by theology. But silence is a fragile weapon. It kills only if memory dies, and memory did not die. It lingered in chapels, in bees, in whispers of northern prophecy. Rome knew this, and so for centuries it hunted symbols, banned spirals, rewrote chronicles. It sought not only to kill bodies, but to kill meaning. Folklore resists, yet folklore is stubborn. Peasants sang songs of golden-haired kings who would return when the world grew dark. In the Ardennes, stories spoke of Dagobert II sleeping beneath a hill, waiting to rise again. In the Pyrenees, legends told of bees guarding a hidden crown. In Scandinavia, sagas whispered of a southern prince who came by sea bearing prophecy. Rome could silence chronicles, it could not silence songs. The sacred blood lived on in memory, a theology of fear. Why did the church care so much? Because power is fragile when built on faith. If the people believed kingship could exist without papal sanction, Rome's authority crumbled. If the people believed blood itself could be holy, then papal oil was meaningless. The Merovingians were not simply rivals. They were a theological threat, a threat that could not be conquered by sword, only by silence. The Inquisition of symbols. Centuries later, as the Inquisition rose, certain heresies were hunted with unusual zeal. Among them were groups that revered bees, spirals, roses, symbols linked to Merovingian memory. Cathars, Templars, mystics. All were accused of heresy, their books burned, their relics destroyed. Again and again the same motifs appear. Again and again they are targeted. Coincidence or continuity of fear? The living blood. Yet for all the bans, the burnings, the erasures, the question persisted. What if the blood survived? What if children were spirited away before shears fell? What if noble families in the north carried the line in silence? What if the Templars, in their flight, guarded not only relics, but heirs? Rome's fear suggests it believed the possibility. For only a living threat demands such relentless suppression. A walk through silence. Imagine walking through a Frankish graveyard centuries after the fall. You see stones broken, symbols defaced, spirals chipped away. Yet here and there, faintly, a bee still lingers, weathered but visible. You kneel, you touch the stone. You feel the hum beneath it, not of insects, but of memory. The church forbade, the church erased, yet the earth remembers. Rome's shadow. The story of the Merovingians is as much about Rome as it is about kings. Rome feared them not because they were weak, but because they were strong in ways Rome could not control. Hair, blood, bees, spirals, these were sacraments outside papal reach. And so, Rome did what it always did with threats. It rebranded them. It made them laughable, heretical, forgotten. But laughter fades, heresy returns, silence hums, the fear that endures. Even today, when scholars dismiss Merovingian myths as fantasy, the echo of Rome's fear lingers. Why else in medieval councils were bees banned? Why else were chronicles so insistent that Merovingians were weak? Why else were their relics plundered, their memory erased? Fear leaves fingerprints, and Rome's fingerprints are everywhere in the erasure of the long-haired kings. The Merovingians did not simply vanish, they were silenced. And silence, as we know, is not death, it is preservation. The spiral turns, the hive hums, the blood remembers. Words can be silenced, chronicles can be rewritten, kings can be shorn, dethroned, erased. But symbols endure. Symbols move in silence, carved into wood, etched into stone, sewn into cloth. They pass like whispers through generations, a language older than alphabets. For the Merovingians, 3 symbols rose above all others. 3 emblems that appear again and again in tombs, chapels, manuscripts, and folk tales. The bee, the rose, the spiral. Together they form a secret trinity, a code that whispers of memory preserved, of bloodline unbroken, of kingship that never died. The bee. We have seen the bee before, swarming around Childeric's body, 300 golden creatures buried with him. The bee is life and resurrection. Fragile, yet eternal. It dies when it stings, yet the hive lives on. It vanishes in winter, only to return in spring. In Egypt, bees were born from the tears of Ra. In Greece, the priestesses of Artemis were called Melissae, bees. In Christian mysticism, the bee symbolized virginity, purity, a creature that carried sweetness from death. For the Merovingians, the bee was not only emblem but essence. It marked their tombs, their seals, their cloaks, and centuries later it marked the north. Bees carved into stave churches, bees hidden in stained glass, bees etched on coins where no bee should be. Always small, always discreet, always whispering, the hive remembers. The rose. The rose appears everywhere, but rarely by accident. In Merovingian chapels, the rose was not merely floral. It was geometric, 6 or 8 petals aligned with sacred proportion, often within a circle. These were not decorations, they were codes. The rose is secrecy. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, meant a secret kept. In Roman times, roses carved into ceilings meant the words spoken beneath them must never be repeated. For the Merovingians, the rose was more than secrecy. It was blood itself, blooming, eternal. The red rose carried connotations of sacrifice and lineage. The white rose, purity of descent. Together they formed a language of silence and inheritance. And in the north, roses bloom in unlikely places, on beams of wood in Norwegian churches, on tombstones in Sweden, on seals of families whose names echo faintly with southern origins. Not Norse roses, Merovingian roses. The spiral. The spiral is the most enigmatic of all. It appears in Merovingian art carved into tombs and chapels, a coil without beginning or end, turning endlessly inward and outward. The spiral is eternity. The spiral is continuity. It is the fingerprint of creation itself, the golden ratio in shells, in galaxies, in the unfurling of ferns. For the Merovingians, the spiral whispered of bloodline, a coil unbroken, descending through generations, hidden but intact. In the north, spirals appear again, carved into Gotland stones, painted onto chapel walls, woven into patterns on shields. Scholars call them decorative, but when paired with bees and roses, the spiral becomes more than art. It becomes code. The trinity of symbols. Alone, each symbol could be coincidence. Bees could be trade emblems, roses could be Christian, spirals could be Norse decoration. But together? When bee, rose and spiral appear side by side, the pattern is unmistakable. It is a code, a whisper of identity, a signature left for those who knew how to read it. The bee is life preserved, the rose is blood remembered, the spiral is eternity unbroken. Together they say the bloodline lives in silence, the language of the exile. Imagine you're a fugitive in the 8th or 9th century, your dynasty declared extinct, your kingship erased, your children hidden in exile. You cannot proclaim your lineage aloud. Rome would silence you. The Carolingians would erase you. So you speak another language. You carve bees into beams. You paint roses into windows. You etch spirals onto stones. To outsiders, they mean nothing. To insiders, they mean everything. Symbols become passwords. Symbols become memory. Symbols become survival. The Templars and the symbols. The Knights Templar too use symbols. Their crosses flared like Merovingian crosses. Their chapels built on octagons, echoing roses. Their seals bore 2 riders on 1 horse, a spiral of paradox and secrecy. When the Templars fled, they carried with them more than treasure. They carried a language of symbols. They built chapels in Scotland, Sweden, and perhaps Iceland. carving bees, roses, and spirals into stone. The overlap is too close to ignore. The Templars did not invent these symbols, they inherited them. And from whom? The bloodline they guarded? Folk echoes. In folk songs, the symbols linger. In France, peasants sang of a rose that bloomed in winter, guarded by bees. In Sweden, stories told of spirals drawn in snow to mark the path of hidden kings. In Iceland, lullabies spoke of konungsbifluga, the king's bee that hums beneath the ice, waiting for spring. Songs, like symbols, outlast chronicles. They are carried in mouths, not manuscripts, and so they survive. Symbols as resistance. Rome's councils banned these symbols. Spirals forbidden, bees condemned, roses repurposed as Marian emblems. But suppression could not kill them. Instead, they became resistance. To carve a bee into a chapel was to defy Rome. To paint a spiral onto a shield was to declare silent allegiance. To wear a rose was to whisper loyalty to a hidden bloodline. Symbols became rebellion in silence, the hidden map. Some believed the symbols were more than resistance, they were a map. Scattered across Europe and Scandinavia, chapels, graves, and manuscripts bearing bees, roses, and spirals may form a network. A code marking safe havens, hidden families, bloodline guardians. Follow the bees, follow the roses, follow the spirals, and you may trace the path of the exiled Merovingians. Perhaps the northern prophecy was not written in words alone. Perhaps it was etched in symbols across the land, a map carved into silence. Walk the symbolic trail. Picture yourself wandering through Scandinavia. You step into a stave church, see a bee in wood. You walk through a graveyard, see a rose on stone. You pause at a rune stone, see a spiral that is not Norse. Individually, they mean nothing. Together they form a sentence. The crown sleeps, but it is not broken. Symbols are language. Language is memory, memory is survival. The whisper of the trinity. Bee, rose, spiral. They are small. They are fragile. They are overlooked. Yet they have endured longer than crowns, longer than palaces, longer than chronicles. They are the hive humming in silence. They are the blood blooming in secrecy. They are the eternity turning in stone. They are the unspoken oath of the Merovingian legacy. The Merovingians may have been silenced by Rome, erased by chronicles, dethroned by the Carolingians, but their symbols endure. And in those symbols the blood remembers. The spiral turns, the rose blooms, the hive hums, and the silence speaks. History is written with ink, but it is remembered with symbols. When words are forbidden, when chronicles are rewritten, when kings are stripped of crowns and exiled into silence, meaning finds another way to survive. It lingers in the curve of a carving, in the petals of a flower painted on a chapel wall, in the coil of a spiral etched into stone. The Merovingians may have been erased from history books, their sacred haircut, their bloodline declared extinct, but their memory endured in a secret language. 3 emblems repeated across centuries and continents whispered what no scribe dared record. The bee, the rose, and the spiral. The bee, small and fragile, should have meant nothing. Yet in the tomb of Childeric, father of Clovis, 300 golden bees swarmed around his body. They were not ornaments, they were guardians, creatures of resurrection, tokens of life that disappears in winter only to return in spring. In Egypt they were born of the tears of Ra. In Greece they were priestesses of Artemis. In the Christian mysticism of Gaul they carried sweetness out of death. For the Merovingians the bee was an oath, that even when kings are cut down the hive endures. Long after Childeric's tomb was opened, long after the golden insects were stolen, the bee reappeared in unlikely places, in the timber of stave churches in Norway, in fragments of glass in Swedish abbeys, in folk tales of Iceland that spoke of the king's bees humming beneath the ice. The bee travelled silently, too small for Rome to crush, too persistent to vanish. The rose, too, bloomed where it should not. Not the wild rose of fields, but a rose of geometry, 6 or 8 petals carved with mathematical precision, often encircled as if guarding a secret at its heart. In Roman times, to sit sub rosa, under the rose, was to sit in silence, bound by secrecy. For the Merovingians the rose became more than secrecy. It was lineage itself, blood blooming eternal, red for sacrifice, white for purity, the two entwined. When the Merovingians were dethroned, the rose did not vanish. It appeared again in the north, painted on beams of Norwegian churches, etched on Swedish gravestones, woven into coats of arms of obscure families who claimed southern ancestors. To outsiders they were decorations, to those who knew they were reminders that blood still flowered in silence. And then there is the spiral, the most elusive of all, neither plant nor insect but pattern, a coil without beginning or end, the fingerprint of eternity. It appeared on Merovingian tombs, on chapel stones, in the geometry of their relics, a symbol of continuity, of the bloodline unbroken even when the crown was stolen. The spiral is found in seashells and galaxies, in the unfolding of ferns. It is the secret code of creation itself. In Gotland, spirals appear on stones encircled by bees. In churches, spirals wind around roses. In graves, spirals are carved into brooches placed upon the dead. Scholars dismiss them as Norse ornament, but their shape is too precise, too foreign. They are not decoration, they are declaration. The three together, bee, rose, spiral, form a trinity of memory. Alone, they can be explained away. The bee as trade emblem, the rose as Marian flower, the spiral as pagan motif. But together, they speak with a single voice. The bee hums of resurrection, the rose blooms of blood preserved, the spiral coils of eternity. And when all three appear side by side in wood or glass or stone, they form a sentence. The bloodline lives. The crown sleeps, but it is not broken. Imagine being an exile in the 8th or 9th century, your dynasty declared extinct, your sacred hair shorn, your children hunted. You cannot proclaim your lineage aloud. Rome listens, the Carolingians watch. But you can carve a bee into a chapel beam. You can paint a rose in a corner window. You can trace a spiral into the stone of a threshold. Outsiders see decoration, insiders see code. It is how memory survives. The Templars too seem to know this language. Their crosses flared like the Merovingian pate. Their chapels were built upon octagons, echoing the geometry of roses. Their seals bore paradoxes, spirals of meaning hidden in plain sight. When they fled in 1307, perhaps they carried not only gold and relics, but also a symbolic language that bound them to the bloodline they protected. In Scandinavia, the overlap is uncanny. The Templar cross on a chapel door, the rose in a stave beam, the bee etched into glass. Coincidence or inheritance? And in folklore, the symbols took on life of their own. French peasants sang of a rose that bloomed in winter guarded by bees. In Sweden, mothers told their children of spirals drawn in snow to mark the path of hidden kings. In Iceland, lullabies spoke of the king's bee humming beneath the ice, waiting for spring. These were not theological debates, not chronicles written for bishops. They were songs of memory, carried in mouths, preserved in hearts. Rome tried to silence them. The Council of Frankfurt forbade spirals and bees on graves. Abbots defaced carvings, called them pagan, unworthy of Christian burials. Yet the symbols endured. They became resistance in silence. To carve a bee into wood was to defy Rome. To wear a rose was to whisper loyalty to a hidden crown. To etch a spiral into stone was to declare faith in a lineage Rome could not erase. Perhaps the symbols were more than remembrance, perhaps they were also a map. Scattered across Europe and Scandinavia, the sites bearing bees, roses and spirals form a pattern. A network of memory, a constellation of silence. To follow the bee, the rose, and the spiral may be to follow the path of exiles, to trace the trail of the crown hidden in the north. Imagine yourself walking this symbolic trail. You step into a stave church, and in the gloom you see a bee carved into a corner beam. You leave, and in a graveyard nearby you notice a rose etched into a stone. You walk further, and upon a rune stone you see a spiral that feels foreign, deliberate. Each one alone, meaningless. Together they form a sentence written not in ink but in symbol. The crown sleeps, the bloodline lives, eternity coils unbroken. The bee hums softly in silence, the rose blooms in secrecy, the spiral turns forever. Together they form a language that no scissors, no papal decree, no rewritten chronicle could destroy. They are the hidden oath of the Merovingian legacy. They are the whisper of blood that remembers. And so, even in silence, the symbols speak. Legends have long whispered of kings who do not die. They fall in battle, vanish into forests, sink beneath mountains or seas, but they do not perish. Instead, they sleep. They wait. Their return is promised in silence, foretold in prophecy, carried in the breath of ballads and the sighs of old women at firesides. And through these recurring stories, of Arthur in Britain, of Charlemagne in Germany, of kings unnamed in Scandinavia, another name, half buried yet persistent, begins to shimmer. Dagobert, the Merovingian king whose blood spilled in a forest, whose death was too convenient, too silent, too complete. Why does the world need sleeping kings? Perhaps because kingdoms fall, empires collapse, and faith wanes. But the human heart cannot bear to believe that what is sacred is gone forever. To imagine a king asleep, not dead, is to imagine that justice still waits, that hope still lingers, that order can be restored. The motif comforts and unsettles at once, whispering that history is not final, that silence is not emptiness but anticipation. Arthur beneath the hill. Across the channel the British told of Arthur, the once and future king. Betrayed, wounded, carried to Avalon, he did not die but sleeps, waiting to rise again when his people need him most. For centuries peasants claimed to see him ride in storms, to hear his hounds baying at night, to glimpse his crown flashing beneath hills. Arthur's story is not history, it is memory transfigured into hope, and in Gaul Dagobert's death begins to echo the same pattern. The chronicles say he was slain, stabbed in the eye, yet folklore insists he sleeps beneath a hill in the Ardennes, guarded by bees, his hair long and unbroken. Like Arthur, he will return when the time is right, when darkness weighs too heavily on the land. Charlemagne in the cave. The Germans had their own. Charlemagne, who built an empire of steel and scripture, was said not to have died but to sleep in a cave within the Kyffhäuser mountains. His beard grows through the stone table at which he rests. He dreams while ravens circle the peaks, and one day, when they fly no more, he will awaken and ride again. But Charlemagne was the usurper of the Merovingians, crowned by Rome to bury their memory. To imagine him as the sleeping king is to invert the story, to place hope in the one who erased the long-haired dynasty. And perhaps that is precisely why the Dagobert legend was silenced. To allow Charlemagne to sleep was to legitimize him. To admit Dagobert might also sleep was to admit the Merovingians were never broken. The Norse kings beneath the ice. Farther north, in sagas sung beside fjords, there are whispers of kings who lie beneath glaciers, frozen but alive, their breath steady beneath the ice. Farmers claim to hear knocking from under mountains, the hammering of kings preparing to return. These stories echo the northern prophecy. When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken. The Norse knew the motif well. Odin himself was a wanderer who vanished only to return in visions. Balder, the god of beauty and light, died, but was promised rebirth after Ragnarok. To them, the sleeping king was no fantasy but the natural rhythm of myth. Fall, silence, return. Dagobert's silence. Dagobert II, the Merovingian king murdered in a forest, slips easily into this pattern. Too easily. His exile, his return, his sudden assassination. These are the ingredients of legend, of martyrdom transmuted into prophecy. And so, though Rome declared him dead, folktales declared him sleeping. In some French villages, mothers warned their children not to wander near certain hills, for there a king lay dreaming, and to disturb him was to invite fate. In Lorraine, shepherds spoke of a golden-haired figure seen at dusk, half in shadow, half in light, walking the fields as though remembering them. In Alsace, peasants carved spirals into trees, saying they marked the path for the king who would rise again. Rome erased him from chronicles. But memory does not obey decrees. The archetype of return. Across cultures, the motif is the same. A sacred figure does not die. He withdraws, he waits. His presence persists, unbroken, beneath mountains, seas, forests, or ice. This archetype comforts the oppressed, terrifies rulers, and endures because it meets a deep human need. If the sacred dies, all is chaos. But if the sacred sleeps, hope remains. For the Merovingians, whose kingship was tied to blood, hair, and myth, the sleeping king motif was inevitable. They could not vanish without leaving behind the whisper of return. Dagobert's fall in the forest was not an ending, but a threshold. Bees as guardians. The bees return here too. In some legends, Dagobert sleeps not alone but guarded by bees. They swarm above his hidden tomb humming softly, warning away intruders. The bee, symbol of resurrection, becomes his sentinel. When the bees vanish, the legend says, The king will awaken. This imagery is powerful. A hive as army, silence as shield, the hum of insects as prophecy. To peasants, it was reassurance. To Rome, it was danger. And so, bees were forbidden, declared pagan, erased from gravestones. Yet the hum persisted in song and story, a swarm that memory could not kill. The fear of return. Why did Rome fear these stories so deeply? Because a sleeping king is not dead. A dead king is safe. He can be buried, canonized, dismissed. But a sleeping king is a threat. His silence becomes anticipation. His absence becomes presence. To believe Dagobert slept was to believe the Merovingian bloodline lived, to believe the crown would rise again, not by papal oil, but by blood remembered. The motif itself was resistance. Silence as vault. Think of silence not as emptiness, but as a vault, a place where memory is kept, where prophecy waits. The sleeping king rests in silence because silence is protection. In the hush of forests, in the frost of mountains, in the darkness of caves, the motif endures. It tells us that nothing sacred is ever truly lost. It only sleeps. Dagobert sleeps in Gaul. Arthur sleeps in Britain. Charlemagne sleeps in Germany. Kings beneath hills, beneath caves, beneath ice. All whisper the same truth. History is never final. The return. Close your eyes and imagine. You are in a forest at dusk. The trees are heavy with shadow, the air sharp with moss and damp. Somewhere beneath your feet lies a king, his hair long, his body unbroken, his breath steady in silence. Bees hum softly in the distance. The spiral of centuries turns. You realize that the legend of the sleeping king is not about return in the flesh. It is about return in memory. Every time his name is spoken, every time his symbol is carved, every time the silence hums, the king rises. Not as warrior, but as presence. Dagobert does not need to walk again to live. He lives because we remember. The sleeping king motif is not fantasy. It is memory transfigured into myth, resistance transfigured into hope. And in Dagobert's silence, we hear the hum of bees, the coil of spirals, the bloom of roses. He sleeps, but he is not gone. The spiral turns, the hive hums, the king dreams, and in the silence of history his breath endures. If the Merovingians truly vanished, why do whispers of their blood continue to surface in the far north, centuries after their crowns were stripped away? Perhaps because blood is not easily erased. It moves silently, carried in veins, hidden in marriages, buried in genealogies. It does not announce itself, yet it endures. In Scandinavia, amid fjords and forests, certain families emerged, quiet, modest, obscure, yet carrying crests and legends that seemed strangely out of place. The official chronicles are silent. Rome declared the dynasty extinct. The Carolingians wrote themselves as heirs. But silence, as we have seen, is not death. Silence can be preservation. And in the north, silence sheltered families who bore faint but persistent traces of a bloodline once declared sacred. The families of Sweden. In Sweden, genealogists have long puzzled over the Bielka family, whose name means beam. Their coat of arms bears a spiral, neither lion nor eagle nor cross, but a simple coil, turning endlessly inward. To scholars, it is decorative. To those who know the Merovingian symbols, it is a signature. A spiral is never only ornament, it is eternity. It is memory refusing to end. The Bielks themselves claim descent from knights who came from the south. Though no chronicler records who these knights were, their arrival is timed to the late 13th century, the very era of the vanished Templar fleet. Coincidence or continuity? In Västergötland, another family, the Stures, bore a coat of arms with roses. At first glance, Christian, roses had long been associated with the Virgin Mary. But the roses of the Stures were geometric, six-petalled, mathematical, closer to Merovingian than Marian. Their records too speak of marriage to foreigners, warriors who arrived by sea, the families of Norway. Norway tells its own quiet stories. The Galt family kept records of a marriage to men described as brothers in white. Their crest was unusual, not axes or ships, but a rose. In coastal regions, chapels tied to their estates bear spirals carved into beams. Scholars insist these were simply borrowed designs from European travellers. Yet why always these three symbols? Why always the bee, the rose, the spiral? Some Galti tombs show traces of bees, etched faintly on stone long weathered by rain. When asked, villagers spoke of foreign blood in the family, a lineage never fully explained. In Rogaland, oral traditions tell of a golden-haired boy fostered by a noble house, arriving from southern lands. He grew into a man of stern silence, remembered not for deeds but for presence. His descendants bore no crowns, but their faces, the tales say, carried a light in the eyes that did not come from this world. Icelandic shadows. Iceland, farthest from Rome's gaze, preserved the most fragile whispers. The Odovajar family, influential in the 12th and 13th centuries, told of a foreign prince sheltered by their ancestors. Their seal strangely bore a bee encircled by a ring. In Icelandic sagas one finds vague mentions of southern men, tall and pale, who arrived after a war of the white-clad. The descriptions are too brief, too vague, yet they carry an echo. The folk tales are stronger. In one, a child with golden hair and silent eyes is fostered by a farm family. He never speaks, but when he dreams, he whispers in tongues none can understand. The people call him Barn Tognar Konungsins, child of the silent king. The silence of genealogies. What strikes most in these families is not their claims, but their silences. Their genealogies begin abruptly, without record of ancestors before a certain century. Their coats of arms bear symbols that have no local precedent. Their stories reference southern blood without naming it. Silence can be louder than speech. These gaps feel deliberate, as though written to obscure rather than reveal. Perhaps because to name the bloodline outright was dangerous. To claim descent from the Merovingians would be heresy, rebellion, threat. Better to remain silent, better to let symbols speak. Why the north? Why would exiles of a Frankish dynasty flee so far north, to lands of fjords and ice? Because the north lay beyond Rome's reach. The Pope's authority was fragile here, the bishop's power weak. Paganism lingered, old gods whispered in forests. To hide in the north was to disappear not in death, but in silence. And yet to live among Norse nobles was not to vanish. Here too kings traced descent from gods. Here too long hair was sacred. A Merovingian exile with flowing locks would not seem alien. He would seem kin. The myths aligned, the silence fit. The bees of memory. Travellers in Sweden tell of farmhouses that bore carved bees on doorways. No one knew why. Decoration, they said, though the bees were always paired with roses or spirals. In Norway, fishermen painted spirals on their boats, saying it brought luck. In Iceland, lullabies spoke of bees humming beneath the snow, waiting for spring. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of memory encoded in symbol, carried by families who never spoke but always remembered. The role of the Templars. The Templars linger here too. After 1307, when their order was crushed, the north became refuge. If they carried not only treasure but blood, they may have delivered Merovingian heirs into noble houses, securing them through marriage, weaving their legacy into northern veins. The coats of arms, the chapels, the genealogies, all may be the residue of this silent alliance. The Templars vanished into legend. The Merovingians vanished into silence. But together, perhaps, they survived. Silence as inheritance. These families never claimed crowns. They lived as nobles, farmers, guardians of land. Yet their symbols persisted, their genealogies resisted clarity, their folklore whispered of southern kings. Their silence itself became inheritance. To remain unspoken was to remain alive. Bloodlines do not always announce themselves with trumpets. Sometimes they hum like bees, sometimes they bloom like roses in frost, sometimes they coil like spirals beneath stone. A walk among the families. Imagine walking through a Scandinavian village at dusk. The air is sharp, the mountains loom. A farmhouse stands before you, its doorway carved with roses. A chapel nearby bears a spiral etched into wood. The local family crest shows a bee, small and golden. The people do not speak of Merovingians. They do not even know the name, but their symbols tell a story they themselves may have forgotten, that in their blood flows a lineage exiled but unbroken. That the crown sleeps, but it hums in their veins. The quiet northern bloodlines are not proof. They are whispers. But whispers are how memory survives when chronicles fall silent. They are enough to suggest that the Merovingian story did not end in monasteries, but continued in fjords and forests, in families who lived without crowns but with silence. The spiral turns. the rose blooms, the hive hums, and in the veins of forgotten families the blood remembers. When a dynasty falls, its survival depends not only on exile but on alliance. Blood alone cannot endure without protection, without roots to anchor it in foreign soil. And so, if the Merovingian heirs truly found their way to Scandinavia, whether carried by Templars or hidden by sympathizers, they would have needed more than silence. They would have needed bonds with the land's own rulers, alliances sealed not by crowns but by marriages, oaths and secrets whispered beneath timbered roofs. The north, though remote from Rome's gaze, was no simple refuge. Its nobles traced descent from gods, its warriors fought with ferocity, its kings tolerated no rivals. To survive here, exiles from Gaul would have had to weave themselves into the very fabric of local power, and evidence, faint but persistent, suggests they did. Marriages across the sea. In old Scandinavian genealogies, sudden marriages appear without explanation. Nobles who had always wed their neighbours suddenly take wives or husbands from the south. No names are given, only vague references to knights or princes carried by ships. In Norway, one such record tells of a marriage between a local chieftain and a woman described as of golden hair, descended from far-off kings. Her name is lost, but her children became prominent landholders in Rogaland. Their crests bore roses, not axes or wolves. In Sweden, the Bjelke line claims an ancestor who came across the sea, knight of foreign order. His children married into noble families, and from then spirals appeared in their heraldry. The details are hazy, the documents incomplete, as though deliberately blurred. But the pattern is there. Outsiders woven into noble houses, their symbols carried forward through marriage. Knowledge as gift. Alliances are not made of blood alone, they are sealed by exchange, and the Merovingian exiles, if they survived, carried something valuable: knowledge. They had inherited not only bloodlines but traditions of kingship, secrets of geometry, fragments of Roman and Frankish learning. To Norse nobles, still rooted in oral sagas, such knowledge would have been precious. One saga tells of southern men, who taught northern kings how to align their halls with the rising sun. Another legend speaks of a foreign guest who drew spirals in the snow, claiming they were the paths of stars. Local lords respected such wisdom. To accept exiles into their families was not charity, it was advantage. The pact of silence, yet alliances of this kind required silence. If Rome learned that Merovingian heirs lived, if Carolingian spies traced their lineage, danger would follow. And so, the pacts were secret. The families did not boast of their southern blood. They did not proclaim their connections. Instead, they encoded them in symbols, in crests and carvings. The bee in a chapel beam, the rose on a shield, the spiral etched on a doorway. These were not decoration, but signatures of alliance. The silence was itself the oath. We protect you, and in return you bring memory, symbol, blood. Military bonds. There are tales too of warriors. In Icelandic sagas, references appear to white-clad brothers who fought alongside northern kings. They are not named, nor are their origins explained, but their presence is marked by crosses of strange shape and discipline unlike local bands. Could these have been Templars, carrying with them not only relics but loyalty to the bloodline they guarded? Could they have formed the military edge of the silent alliance, mercenaries in appearance, guardians in truth? Local kings valued strong swords, exiles valued protection. Together they forged a pact hidden in plain sight. The geometry of chapels. Architecture bears witness where words do not. In Sweden and Norway, certain chapels stand apart from others. Built not only for worship but with unusual precision, their axes align with stars, their windows form rose patterns, their floors coil in spirals. Such design was foreign to local builders, yet familiar to Frankish and Templar traditions. Could these chapels have been built with the guidance of southern exiles, gifted to their northern protectors as tokens of alliance? They became more than places of prayer. They became symbols of a pact, where foreign blood was sanctified by northern stone. Shared enemies. Rome was not the only power feared in the north. Pagan traditions lingered, rival clans fought, foreign merchants intruded. In such turbulence, alliances with outsiders could be valuable. Exiles offered knowledge, relics, symbols of legitimacy older than papal decrees. In return, local nobles offered shelter, land, marriage, and silence. Both gained what they needed. Both risked nothing by keeping the pact hidden. And perhaps, for some northern families, the Merovingian bloodline was more than protected. It was adopted. To To marry into it was to claim a share of sanctity, to bind one's house to an ancient crown. The whisper in genealogies. Genealogists note peculiarities. Family trees in Scandinavia often stretch deep into the past, boasting of Odin-born kings and Viking heroes. Yet in certain families, gaps appear. Lineages begin abruptly around the 13th or 14th centuries, with founders described simply as foreign knights or southern lords. The names are vague, the origins unexplained. Why preserve such gaps unless the truth was dangerous? It is as if the silence itself is proof. These genealogies hide more than they reveal. They conceal bloodlines too precious to expose, too risky to proclaim. The oath carried forward. If such alliances existed, they were not brief. They endured for generations. Families that sheltered exiles carried their symbols for centuries: bees in crests, roses in chapels, spirals on seals. Children grew who knew nothing of crowns but still inherited blood. They lived as nobles, farmers, merchants. Yet in their veins flowed the whisper of Merovingian lineage. In their houses hung shields with roses. In their stories lingered the hum of bees. The oath of silence passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Not spoken, not written, but lived. The crown in silence. Perhaps this was the prophecy fulfilled. The crown of the southern kings did meet the sleep of the ice, not in armies or palaces, but in families living quietly, bound to northern nobles. The crown did not rise in steel, but in memory. It slept in veins, in symbols, in alliances hidden from Rome. And if the day should come when the bloodline was called upon, it would not rise from nothing. It would rise from silence. From families who had preserved it without ever naming it. A walk through the pact. Imagine standing in a Norwegian valley at dusk. The air is cold, the mountains shadowed. A farmhouse bears a spiral carved above its door. In the chapel nearby, a rose window blooms. The family crest shows a bee. The people speak only of their farm, their ancestors, their land. They know nothing of crowns or exiles, and yet in their silence, the pact lives. They are descendants of an alliance sealed centuries ago, when southern blood sought northern shelter. The pact still breathes, not in proclamations, but in the quiet persistence of symbol and silence. The Merovingians may have lost their throne, but they gained something Rome could never erase. Alliances sealed in silence, families who carried their blood without ever naming it. The spiral turns, the rose blooms, the hive hums, and in the noble houses of the north the blood remembers. History is not only what survives, but also what is missing. Every burned book, every vanished map, every torn page leaves behind an absence that speaks as loudly as words. And in the story of the Merovingians, absence itself becomes a kind of presence. For scattered across Europe and the north are fragments, manuscripts half destroyed, maps whispered about but never seen, that seem to trace a hidden network, a geometry of silence binding together the remnants of a bloodline. The burned codex. In the archives of Geneva, scholars once kept a codex known as the Liber Regum Occultorum, the Book of Hidden Kings. Written in a mixture of Latin and Old French, it was catalogued in the 17th century, noted only as heretical genealogy. When fire swept through part of the collection in 1789, the book was lost. But a catalogue entry survives. It describes the codex as containing a lineage of kings descended from the seaborn Merovech, carried beyond the Alps into the north. One note, written by a librarian's hand, mentions a spiral of chapels built by knights, each aligned to a star. A lost book, a lost genealogy. Yet the catalogue itself whispers. The bloodline was remembered, but not aloud, not in chronicles, only in shadowed texts too dangerous to keep. The map of the spiral. Travellers in the 16th century spoke of a map kept in a monastery in Denmark. It showed not roads or rivers, but chapels and churches across Scandinavia. Drawn as though by a cartographer of secrets, the map arranged these sites in a spiral. At the spiral's centre lay a fjord known for its strange stone, an upright slab carved with a cross that flared like the Templar sign. From that centre, the chapels radiated outward, each marked with a bee or rose. The map was said to be destroyed during the Swedish wars of the 17th century. But rumours linger. Some monks whispered it was never destroyed, only hidden, passed to families who swore silence. If true, the map was not geography, but liturgy, not roads for travellers, but a diagram of survival. The vanished scrolls. In the Loire Valley, where Merovingian kings once ruled, Peasants long told of scrolls hidden in a chapel crypt. During the wars of religion, the crypt was raided, the scrolls seized by Protestant soldiers, then burned. A single fragment survived, described by an antiquarian before it was lost. Per glaciem transit corona. Through ice the crown lives. The phrase mirrors the northern prophecy, the Icelandic manuscript that spoke of southern blood meeting the sleep of the ice. 2 texts, 2 lands, yet one refrain. Coincidence, or fragments of a single tradition copied and carried north? The hidden geometry. Scholars of sacred architecture sometimes notice patterns where none should exist. In Sweden, several chapels form a line pointing toward the North Star. In Norway, stave churches form triangles echoing constellations. Alone, these alignments seem chance. Together, they resemble a hidden geometry, a map inscribed not on parchment, but on the land itself. Perhaps the exiles and their guardians carved their survival into earth and stone, making of Scandinavia a living manuscript, a text too large to burn. The disappearance of proof. Time and again, evidence surfaces only to vanish. Maps misfiled, manuscripts burned, artifacts lost. The bee brooch from Birka, the spiral sword from Rogaland, the stained glass rose of Varnum, each discovered, each gone. It is as though history itself conspires to erase. Or perhaps erasure is deliberate, hands unseen ensuring silence. And yet, the very pattern of disappearance suggests something is being hidden. One does not destroy what has no meaning. The keeper's hand, among whispers of lost texts, is also the whisper of keepers, individuals or families charged with protecting manuscripts and maps, hiding them when danger came. In Sweden, the Bielka family was once accused of holding heretical papers. In Iceland, monks were rumoured to guard southern scrolls in secret vaults. None were ever found, but absence itself becomes testimony. Where there is smoke, there may once have been fire. Perhaps the keepers chose destruction, not betrayal, when Rome or kings pressed too hard. Better to burn than to yield. Better to scatter ashes than to surrender blood. The geometry of silence. Imagine a map of Europe not with kingdoms and borders, but with symbols. Bees carved into chapels, roses etched into shields, spirals engraved into stones. Draw the lines between them, and patterns emerge. Spirals, constellations, paths invisible to outsiders. This is the geometry of silence, a hidden cartography of memory, a network not of roads but of symbols. Perhaps the lost manuscripts and maps were not records of fiction, but guides to this hidden network, passed from hand to hand, burned when danger threatened, but never truly lost. The whisper of the north. In Icelandic sagas, there is mention of a map of stars drawn upon the land. In Norwegian folklore, peasants spoke of churches aligned like the coils of a serpent. These may be echoes of the spiral map remembered in myth. The language of maps merges with prophecy. The land itself becomes manuscript. The north becomes archive, and within it the bloodline sleeps, not broken, but preserved in silence. Walking the absent trail. Close your eyes and imagine you are holding one of these lost maps. The parchment is brittle, the ink faded, yet you see chapels marked with roses, stones marked with bees, constellations traced in spirals. You place the map against the sky, and stars align with churches, fjords align with bees, valleys coil like spirals. You realize the map is not guiding you to treasure, but to memory. It does not reveal gold, but continuity. It whispers, the crown lives through ice. Even if the map burns, the land itself remembers. The silence remembers. The value of absence. Absence is not nothing. It is invitation. A burned book whispers that it once spoke too loudly. A vanished map suggests it once revealed too much. The Merovingian trail is made not only of relics preserved, but of relics erased. And in the erasure, we glimpse fear. Rome feared these manuscripts. Kings feared these maps. They would not have burned them otherwise. The fragments that remain, the catalogue entries, the folk tales, the echoes, are enough to tell us that something was hidden. The Merovingian legacy survives not only in bees and roses, but in absences, lost manuscripts, hidden maps, vanished scrolls. Each absence is a shadow of presence, each silence a hum of memory. The spiral turns, the parchment burns, the map vanishes, and still, the silence speaks. The past does not stay buried. Bones rise from the soil, relics surface from rivers, and even blood whispers through centuries. In the modern age, silence has new enemies: science, archaeology, and the restless curiosity of those who believe history has hidden too much. For the Merovingians, erased by Rome, exiled into silence, remembered only in symbols, this new light has proven both revealing and dangerous. Excavations in the Old Kingdom. In the 20th century, archaeologists reopened tombs thought long forgotten. At Tournai, where Childeric III had once been laid to rest, the site of his vanished golden bees was studied again. Fragments of artifacts survived: jewellery, weapons, shards of gold. Though most of the treasure had been stolen or melted centuries earlier, the soil itself seemed to hum with presence. Nearby, another grave was uncovered, containing a skeleton unusually tall for its time. Genetic analysis was attempted, but the samples were reported contaminated. Officially, the results were inconclusive. Yet one researcher wrote privately that the DNA markers resembled populations not of northern Gaul but of the Basque regions. Anomalous, unexpected, unexplainable. Shortly after, his paper was withdrawn. The silence of Rome seemed to stretch forward through time, finding new ways to cover what was inconvenient. Anomalies in the blood. In the 1990s, geneticists studying European populations identified peculiar markers in southwestern France, particularly among the Basque people. Their blood seemed older, distinct, resistant to easy classification. Some suggested these markers hinted at lineages predating Indo-European migrations. Others whispered of something else, that these markers connected to fragments found in Merovingian remains. Of course, such claims never reached mainstream journals. Datasets vanished, studies were corrected, results dismissed as error. Yet the whispers persist. What if the Merovingian bloodline was not only legend? What if traces still run in veins today, hidden not in chapels but in chromosomes? The silent research. In 2002, a French team attempted to sequence DNA from remains at Saint-Denis, where many kings of France were buried. Some samples degraded, others inconclusive. Yet rumours spread that one set of results revealed connections to families still alive in southern France and northern Spain. The data was never published. The archives note only, retracted for technical reasons. But silence itself speaks. Why retract? Why hide? Unless the results unsettled more than they explained. The archaeology of absence. Excavations in Scandinavia add to the mystery. In Gotland, graves mixing Norse and Frankish elements revealed bones that did not match local genetic profiles. One skeleton bore isotopic signatures suggesting childhood far to the south, perhaps Gaul, perhaps Aquitaine. Yet the grave goods were distinctly Norse, as though the person had been adopted into northern life. In Rogaland, Norway, a child's skeleton was found with a brooch shaped like a bee. Tests suggested the bone chemistry matched diets of Frankish regions, not Scandinavian. Again, the report was filed, then quietly shelved. Always the same pattern: discovery, anomaly, silence. The disappearance of data. Modern databases of European genetics are vast, mapping migrations across millennia. Yet when independent researchers seek Merovingian samples, they encounter walls. Officially, DNA from royal tombs is unavailable, contaminated, or unsuitable for study. Unofficially, it feels like a vault has been closed. Why such caution? Why such secrecy over a dynasty declared extinct more than a millennium ago? Unless silence is still being guarded, unless the bloodline still matters, beneath science. To walk through a modern laboratory is not unlike walking through a crypt. Machines hum, lights flicker, data scrolls across screens. Scientists speak in whispers, cautious with conclusions. But beneath the charts and sequences, another hum lingers. The same hum we have heard through bees, through silence, through prophecy. Science thinks it speaks only of molecules and markers. Yet what it uncovers echoes old legends. Every anomaly in the blood, every misfiled result, every withdrawn paper feels like the ghost of the Merovingians stirring in their sleep. The fear of revelation. Why suppress results? Some say to protect privacy, others to avoid sensationalism, but perhaps the fear is deeper. If modern science confirmed that the Merovingians carried unique markers, preserved in living families, what would it mean? That a sacred bloodline truly endured, that Rome's erasure failed, that symbols whispered truth all along. It would mean crowns and papal oil were not the only sources of legitimacy. Blood itself would rise again, not in myth, but in measurable strands of DNA. For a world built on the belief that history is tidy, such a revelation would be unbearable. whispers of living descendants. Rumours persist of families today, obscure nobles in France, quiet farmers in Sweden, old lineages in Iceland, whose genetics bear anomalies. Some have golden hair that never darkens, eyes of startling brightness, uncanny height. Stories say they dream vividly, speak in tongues while asleep, hum without knowing why. These are folk tales, unverified, perhaps fanciful, yet they echo the same motifs: hair as inheritance, silence as presence, the hum of bees in the blood. If true, they would be the living spiral, the rose blooming still, the hive humming through centuries. Science meets myth. Imagine for a moment a geneticist in a sterile room. She runs a test, expecting ordinary data. But when the sequences appear, they do not match expected profiles. They link instead to anomalies recorded decades earlier, anomalies tied to bones labelled Merovingian. She frowns, recalibrates, repeats. The result is the same. She pauses, hearing the faint hum of machines but feeling instead the hum of something older, something living. She realizes she has touched a silence preserved for over 1,000 years. What does she do? Publish and risk ridicule or suppression? Hide the data as so many have before? Silence continues even in laboratories. The legacy of hidden blood. If the Merovingian bloodline persists, it does not shout. It does not wear crowns or march armies. It moves quietly, humming beneath skin, coiling through chromosomes like spirals of memory. Science may yet uncover it, but science too can be silenced. What cannot be silenced is the hum itself, the persistence of anomalies, the refusal of blood to lie. The Merovingians may have been shorn, exiled, erased, but in marrow and molecule, in silence and secrecy, they may endure. A walk through the modern crypt. Picture yourself not in a chapel but in a laboratory. The lights are harsh, the air cold with filtered sterility. Machines hum, data streams. Yet beneath it all, you feel the same stillness you once felt at the tomb, the chapel, the spiral stone. You look at the DNA sequence scrolling across the screen. Letters, A, C, T, G, form patterns you cannot fully understand. But you sense something there, hidden in code. Not myth, not symbol, but blood itself, whispering across centuries. The hum grows louder, the silence speaks. The modern age believes it can dissect truth. Yet even here, among microscopes and sequences, the Merovingians remain elusive. Their legacy resists exposure, slipping back into silence whenever it is touched. And yet, silence is not absence. It is preservation. The spiral turns, the genome coils, the hive hums, and the blood remembers. There are legacies carved in stone, sung in epic verse, paraded in gilded crowns, and there are legacies carried in silence, softer, less visible, but no less enduring. For the Merovingians, stripped of their throne, erased from chronicles, hunted through centuries, silence itself became their inheritance, not absence, not defeat, but a chosen strategy, a vault in which memory could be preserved beyond the reach of swords and papal decrees. Silence as vault. When Childeric's hair was shorn, when Dagobert fell in a forest, when manuscripts burned and bees were banned, the dynasty could have vanished entirely. But instead, silence absorbed them. It became the chamber where their myth was stored. Think of silence not as emptiness, but as architecture. A crypt without walls, a hive humming beneath snow, a spiral turning inward, invisible but unbroken. The Merovingian inheritance was not jewels or lands, but this silence, a legacy that preserved blood, symbol and prophecy without ever naming them. This is why their memory endures in whispers rather than declarations. Declarations can be crushed. Whispers can pass undetected, carried from mouth to mouth, beam to beam, stone to stone. Silence became the dynasty's most faithful guardian. The power of not speaking. What Rome feared most was not rebellion, but remembrance. To remember openly was dangerous, but to remember silently was invincible. Families in Sweden painted roses on shields without explaining why. Nobles in Norway carried spirals in their crests, never naming their origin. Icelandic lullabies spoke of bees humming beneath ice, but never mentioned Merovingians. This is silence as inheritance, memory carried without words, symbols preserved without explanation. The less spoken, the safer it became. The weight of silence, yet silence is heavy. Imagine carrying a secret for generations, never naming it, never confirming it, yet feeling it hum beneath your life. A noble family in Sweden sees a spiral on their crest and feels both pride and unease. A farmer in Iceland sings of bees, but does not know why. The memory persists, but in shadows. Silence protected, but it also burdened. It made heirs invisible, turned bloodlines into ghosts. And yet, perhaps that was the point. A visible king could be killed, a silent heir could endure. Silence and symbol. Silence does not erase, it transforms. The bee became silence incarnate. It hums, it works unseen, it dies quietly, but the hive lives on. The rose bloomed in silence. Beneath it secrets were sworn, promises made never to be spoken aloud. The spiral coiled in silence. Its endless turn was not shouted, but traced quietly, patiently in stone and memory. Each symbol carried silence as part of its meaning. Together they formed a language that required no voice. Silence in the north. In Scandinavia, silence had always been part of the land. Snow muffles sound, fjords swallow echoes, forests whisper more than they speak. To bring a bloodline into such a land was fitting. Here, silence was natural, even sacred. The exiles did not need to proclaim themselves. The land itself taught them silence. Kingship slept beneath ice, lineage coiled beneath moss, memory hummed in wooden beams. In the north, silence was not only strategy, it was inheritance aligned with place. Silence as resistance. Rome could ban bees, Rome could forbid spirals, Rome could shave kings, but Rome could not forbid silence. Silence is rebellion that cannot be punished, because it cannot be proved. When peasants carved bees into barns, when nobles bore roses in their crests, when monks sang lullabies of kings who slept, they resisted without resisting. Silence became their form of defiance. A dynasty dethroned became a dynasty diffused, spread through silence into countless small acts of memory, impossible to eradicate. Silence and prophecy. The northern prophecy itself is wrapped in silence. Half Latin, half Norse, its words murmur rather than proclaim. When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken. It does not say when, it does not say how, it does not even name the Merovingians. It whispers, and in whispering it survives. Silence, paradoxically, is what keeps prophecy alive. A shouted prophecy is refuted. A whispered one lingers, adaptable, unending. Silence in science. Even in modern times, silence continues. DNA results vanish. Excavations are labelled inconclusive. Artifacts are misplaced. It is as if the old strategy still works. The bloodline's inheritance of silence shaping even the way discoveries are handled. Perhaps this is chance. Perhaps it is more. Perhaps silence itself has become part of the bloodline's defence, a cloak woven over centuries that still holds today. Silence as identity. To inherit silence is strange. It means never naming oneself, yet always carrying something unspoken. It means living outwardly ordinary lives, farmers, merchants, nobles of no great renown, while inwardly carrying the hum of something older, heavier, sacred. Silence itself becomes the crown. The act of not speaking becomes the ritual. The absence of declaration becomes the proof of continuity. The Merovingians may have lost their throne, but they gained a deeper legacy. The ability to survive without being seen, to persist without proclamation, to live in silence as inheritance. Walking through inheritance. Imagine walking through a Scandinavian village at night. The air is still, snow muffles sound. A farmhouse bears a spiral carved above its door. A chapel nearby has a rose painted faintly in its beams. No one mentions them. No one explains them. The people pass by in silence. Yet you feel it. The hum beneath the wood. The whisper in the snow. The inheritance of silence still breathes here. Not declared, not owned, not even consciously remembered, but present. Silence itself is the heirloom passed from century to century, worn not on crowns but in gestures, carvings, songs. The crown of silence. Perhaps this was the true destiny of the Merovingians. Not to reign visibly, but to reign invisibly. Not to hold thrones, but to hold memory. Not to wield swords, but to wield silence. For silence cannot be dethroned, it cannot be shaved, it cannot be burned, it coils like the spiral, blooms like the rose, hums like the bee. The Merovingians may no longer sit on Europe's thrones, but their inheritance, silence, remains stronger than crowns. It endures in symbols, in anomalies, in whispers carried through centuries. Silence as inheritance is not absence. It is presence unspoken. It is the crown that sleeps, the blood that remembers, the prophecy that waits. The spiral turns, the hive hums, the rose blooms unseen, and in silence, the dynasty endures. The snow falls again. It has always been snow. From the moment we began, standing before the stone in the north, listening for whispers carved into granite, until now, as the story winds toward its close, snow has been our companion. It muffles sound, softens the world, makes silence into something almost tangible, and perhaps that is fitting. For silence has been the true heirloom of this tale, the crown no one can seize, the memory no one can fully erase. We began with the seaborn ancestor Merovech, a child of waves and myth. We followed Clovis into the baptismal waters where faith and calculation entwined. We walked beside the long-haired kings, whose hair itself was their sacrament, their undoing, their power. We stood at Childeric's tomb, surrounded by golden bees, and followed Dagobert into the forest where his eye was struck and his body silenced. We listened to the prophecy in the north, traced the vanished fleet of the Templars, wandered through stave churches where roses, spirals and bees were hidden in beams. We touched graves that did not fit, manuscripts that vanished in fire, and DNA results that disappeared into silence. And now, here we are again, before the stone in the snow, the stone of the Whispering King. The stone as mirror. When we first touched it, it was cold, impossibly so, as though it drank the warmth from our skin. Now, after the long journey, it feels different. Not warmer, still as frozen as the night air, but more alive, more aware. Perhaps the stone itself has listened as we have listened. Perhaps the echo of our attention has awakened something long dormant. The flared cross still marks its surface. Faint pigment still clings to the grooves. Snow gathers in its cracks like memory filling absence. And if you press your ear close enough, you may hear it again. The hum, not quite a sound, not quite silence, like the faint vibration of bees beneath winter earth. The stone is no longer only an artifact. It is a mirror. It shows us not just the story of a vanished dynasty, but our role in remembering it. The listener as keeper. For what is the purpose of this tale, if not to invite you, the listener, into its silence? Kings may be lost, manuscripts burned, DNA suppressed, symbols misread. But you have heard. You have carried the story through the night, through the slow unfolding of words, through the long hush of centuries. That is the inheritance now, not crowns, not relics, but memory. To listen is to keep. To remember is to guard. Perhaps this was the true prophecy all along, that the bloodline would rise not through armies, but through echoes, that the silence would speak not through rulers, but through listeners, that each person who carries the hum in their heart becomes part of the hive, part of the spiral, part of the rose blooming unseen. The weight of echoes. Echoes are fragile yet enduring. A whisper spoken in a cave can carry for miles. A story told at night can survive centuries. The Merovingians lived not in chronicles, but in echoes. Their bees buzzed faintly through folk songs. Their roses bloomed in carvings peasants never explained. Their spirals turned in chapels no one thought to question. Now, their echo lives in you. You have walked their path through forests, across seas, into frozen fjords, into laboratories where machines hum with secrets. The echo is yours to carry. And echoes, when carried, change the world, not with thunder, but with persistence. The return that is not return. Legends of sleeping kings always speak of return. Arthur will rise, Charlemagne will awaken, Dagobert will walk again. But perhaps the return was never meant to be flesh and bone. Perhaps the return is happening already, in memory. Every time a listener hears the hum, every time a bee is carved, every time a rose blooms in frost, the king returns. Not to rule, but to remind. Not to conquer, but to echo. The Merovingians do not need thrones. Their crown is silence, their kingdom memory, their power the persistence of whispers. And in listening you have become part of that return. The invitation. So let the snow fall. Let silence deepen. Close your eyes and feel the hum steady and low beneath the world's noise. Imagine the spiral turning, endlessly inward and outward, a path of memory that never ends. Imagine the rose blooming unseen, its petals opening not in gardens but in minds. Imagine the hive beneath winter soil, alive, waiting for spring. You're not merely a listener, you are a keeper. The story does not end when the words fade. It continues in the quiet you carry, in the dreams you will have tonight, in the strange images that will linger. The stone, the bees, the forest, the crown, cold but unbroken. This is the inheritance passed now to you, the crown of silence. Do not think of it as burden. Think of it as crown, not of gold or gem, but of silence, humming softly around you, resting lightly upon your head as you drift into sleep. The Merovingians are gone. The Merovingians endure. Both truths coil together like a spiral, and within that paradox lies the beauty of history. Not fixed, not final, but echoing, humming, sleeping, waiting. And so we end where we began, with the whispering stone in the snow, a mirror, a hum, a silence. The king does not speak, the king does not rise, but the king waits, and you, listener, are now part of that waiting. The spiral turns, the rose blooms unseen, the hive hums, the crown sleeps cold but unbroken, and in silence you remember,